Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The White Noise Diary. Phase 1, The Unsettling Mundane. Entry 01, The Color of Static. It began with the fridge. A low, persistent C-sharp where a B-flat used to be. For most people, that sentence would be meaningless, the ramblings of a synesthete or a lunatic. For me, Leah Halpern, age 38 and freelance audio engineer, it was a declaration of war. My life is sound. I don't just hear it, I dissect it. I live in a world of frequencies, of waveforms, of the delicate architecture of noise. The sonic character of my house in the sleepy suburbs of Etobicoke was as familiar to me as the lines on my own hand. The sigh of the HVAC system, the gurgle of the pipes, the gentle 60-cycle hum of the electrical grid that underpins all modern silence. It was my baseline, the control group for my sanity. And it was changing. The divorce had finalized 3 months prior. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, had packed his things with quiet efficiency, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any argument we'd ever had. The house, our shared dream, was now just mine. Too big, too quiet. To fill the void, I threw myself into work, turning the spare bedroom into a meticulously calibrated home studio. My days became a procession of other people's sounds, mastering an indie band's EP, cleaning up dialogue for a podcast, designing the satisfying thwomp of a closing car door for a commercial. My world shrank to the space between my studio monitors and my Sennheiser HD 650s. That's where I first noticed the intrusion. I was polishing the final mix for a folk singer, a delicate track with acoustic guitar and a breathy female vocal. I was hunting for stray plosives, the tiny puffs of air that can explode a microphone diaphragm. And there it was. A low-frequency drone. Not in the recording. I checked the isolated tracks, it was clean. It was in the room. A hum, hovering around 130.8 Hz. A C-sharp. I took off my headphones. The sound was still there, a phantom vibration in the air. I walked around the studio, my ear cocked like a confused dog. It wasn't the computer fan, not the monitors themselves. I traced it to the wall, to the power outlet. I unplugged the power conditioner that fed my entire rig. The drone vanished. Ground loop, I muttered, relieved. An amateur mistake. I spent the next 2 hours rerouting cables, checking my grounding, even swapping out the conditioner for an old one from the garage. I plugged everything back in. The drone returned, unwavering. The same precise C-sharp. It wasn't a flaw in my system. It was coming from the power itself. I tried to dismiss it. Stress, I told myself. Auditory pareidolia. My brain, starved for the familiar cacophony of life with Daniel, was inventing patterns in the static. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Anya Sharma whom I spoke to over Zoom once a week, would have a field day with the symbolism. Leah, the audio engineer, haunted by a rogue frequency. But then it spread. The next morning, the big stainless steel fridge Daniel had insisted on, the one with the ice dispenser we used maybe twice, began its cooling cycle. It had always been a solid B-flat, a comforting, predictable rumble. Now, it was different. Higher. Sharper. It harmonized perfectly with the C-sharp from my studio. A dissonant, unsettling major second. I stood in my kitchen, coffee halfway to my lips, and just listened. The house was playing a new, discordant chord. Later that day, I noticed the new LED bulbs I'd installed in the pot lights emitted a high, thin whine, a G-sharp so piercing it sat at the very edge of my hearing. My house, my sanctuary, was slowly, methodically, being tuned to a new and malevolent key. A week passed. The sonic strangeness became a constant, unwelcome companion. I felt a low-grade tension coiling in my gut. Sleep offered little respite. I'd wake in the dead of night, certain that the hum from the furnace vent had changed its rhythmic pattern. I started keeping a log. Not just a journal of my feelings, but a technical diary. October 12, 11:40 p.m. Ambient hum dominant frequency holding steady at 130.8 Hz, refrigerator cycle now includes a distinct overtone at approximate 261.6 Hz. It's a perfect octave. This is not random. October 14, 7:15 a.m. Streetlights outside bedroom window just shut off. A corresponding dip in the electrical hum, a brief glissando down and then back up, like a sigh. Am I losing my mind? I scheduled an audiologist appointment. Dr. Singh, a man with impressively steady hands and a calming voice, put me through a battery of tests. My hearing, he declared, was not just normal, it was exceptional. The kind of frequency differentiation one would expect from a musician or, well, an audio engineer, he'd said with a smile. It wasn't a comfort. It was a curse. My finely tuned ears were my own private torture chamber. The first time I saw the headphones, it was on Mark. Mark from next door, a retiree whose life revolved around his prize-winning roses and his golden retriever, Buster. He was a creature of habit. Every morning at 9, he'd be out front, weeding or pruning, always ready with a cheerful wave. One Tuesday, I glanced out my window and saw him kneeling by his rose bushes, a pair of sleek, silver noise-canceling headphones hugging his ears. They looked expensive, the kind I'd see advertised to business travelers. It was odd. Mark loved the sounds of the neighborhood, the birdsong, the distant chime of an ice cream truck. He'd told me so himself. Later that day, I was bringing in my recycling bin when he came over to fetch his. Buster trotted alongside him, leash-free. "Morning, Mark," I called out. He didn't respond. He was focused on latching his gait, his movements deliberate and smooth. "Mark," I said, a little louder. He turned, and a placid smile spread across his face. He lifted a hand in a wave, then pointed to his headphones and shrugged, the international gesture for "can't hear you, sorry." "New headphones?" I mouthed, pointing at them. He nodded, his smile unwavering. He looked serene. Unnaturally so. He gave another little wave and then turned, gliding back into his house with Buster at his heels. I dismissed it. Maybe his son bought them for him for his birthday. A way to listen to podcasts while gardening. Perfectly normal. But then it was the teenager 2 houses down, the one with the perpetually purple hair, walking her bulldog. Huge, black headphones. Then Mrs. Gable from across the street, a woman in her 70s, pushing her walker to the mailbox, tiny white earbuds nestled in her ears. A trend. It had to be a trend. People were cocooning. The world was loud and stressful, they were buying themselves pockets of silence. I saw it at the grocery store, the Metro on Bloor Street. The cashier, a young woman with a name tag that read Chloe, had a single white bud in her left ear. She scanned my items with a detached efficiency, her eyes slightly unfocused. A man in the produce section, meticulously examining avocados, had a large pair of Bose headphones on. A mother navigating a cart with a screaming toddler was wearing sleek Apple AirPods Max, an expression of pure calm on her face that did not match the chaotic scene she was presiding over. I felt a prickle of something cold and sharp. They weren't just listening to music. Their faces held the same expression I'd seen on Mark. A vacant placidity. A disconnection that went deeper than just ignoring ambient noise. That night, I called Daniel. The conversation was stilted, as it always was now. We talked about bills, about the logistics of selling some of our shared furniture. Then, I took a breath. "Dan, can I ask you something weird?" "Leah, all your questions are weird," he said. It wasn't mean-spirited, just a statement of fact. It was one of the things he used to love about me. "The house, does it sound different to you? When you were last here?" A pause. Sound different? How? The electricity. The appliances. There's this hum. It's in a different key. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with pity. Lee, it's a house. It makes house noises. You're spending too much time alone in there. You've got your audiophile ears on all the time, you're hearing things that nobody else does. But it's not just me, I said, my voice rising slightly. Everyone is, they're all wearing headphones, Dan. All the time. On our street. It's like they're trying to block something out. It's called an iPhone, Leah. People like podcasts. You're stressed. The divorce, it's taken a toll. Maybe you should try to get out more. See people. He was trying to be helpful. But every word he spoke felt like a shovelful of dirt, burying me deeper in my own isolation. He couldn't hear it. Dr. Singh couldn't find a reason for it. And everyone else was plugging their ears. I wasn't just the only one hearing the new sound of the world. I was the only one left listening. Underscore 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 underscore. Entry 02, the geometry of silence. The world kept turning, but I felt like I was standing still, watching it through thick, soundproof glass. The hum became my unwilling obsession. I couldn't not hear it. It was the foundation upon which all other sounds were now built. The chirping of a sparrow in the backyard was no longer just a chirp, it was a grace note played over the oppressive C-sharp chord droning from the walls. My work, once a refuge, became a laboratory. I bought a high-end spectrum analyzer, a device far more powerful than the software plugins I typically used. The glowing green display became my oracle. I spent hours capturing and mapping the sounds of my own home. The hum wasn't static. It was maddeningly, brilliantly complex. It had rhythm, cadence. The primary 130.8 Hz tone was the canvas, but other frequencies would fade in and out, creating shifting harmonics, complex overtones. They seemed to respond to stimuli. A car driving down the street would cause a brief flutter in the 500 Hz range. When my phone rang, a high-pitched frequency at 2 kHz would spike for a fraction of a second, like an echo. It was adaptive. It was listening. My white noise diary grew thicker, its pages filled with graphs, timestamps, and frantic, scrawled notes. October 21st, 2:33 a.m. Woke up. Complete silence. Hum gone. Checked clock, power out. Lasted maybe 4 to 5 seconds. When it returned, the G-sharp from the LEDs was gone. Replaced by an F. The chord has changed. A CF dyad. A perfect fourth. More stable. More resolved. Is this an update? These micro outages became a recurring phenomenon. A flicker of lights, the digital clock on the oven flashing 12 o'clock, and then the hum would return, subtly altered. Each time, it felt less like a malfunction and more like a system reboot. Each time, the silence in those few seconds of darkness was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was a glimpse of an absence, a reminder that the noise was an active presence, not a passive byproduct. My isolation deepened. I tried going for coffee at my old favorite spot, a little cafe in Bloor West Village. The place was full, but silent. Not library silent, but a dead, muffled quiet. Nearly every patron was ensconced in their own personal cone of silence, headphones on, faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. The two baristas, a young man and woman who used to have a running, flirtatious banter, now worked in tandem with minimal interaction, both with a single white earbud tucked in. I ordered a latte. The young man, Leo, smiled at me, a blank, pleasant smile. "One cappuccino," he said, his voice flat. "A latte, please," I corrected gently. He blinked, his smile not faltering. He just nodded and turned to the espresso machine. A few minutes later, he placed a cappuccino on the counter. "Here you go," he said, the same placid tone. I looked at the cup, then at him. He was already turning to the next customer, his attention elsewhere. Or, more accurately, nowhere. It wasn't rudeness. It was a fundamental disconnect. Arguing felt as pointless as reasoning with a vending machine. I took the cappuccino, left my money on the counter, and walked out. The coffee tasted bitter. I abandoned my attempts at social interaction. The grocery store became a tactical mission: get in, get what I need, get out. I used the self-checkout to avoid the cashiers with their placid smiles and their earbuds. The neighborhood walks I used to take to clear my head were now exercises in dread. I'd see them, my neighbors, drifting along the sidewalks like ghosts. Their movements seemed more fluid, more economical than before. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. Just a smooth, purposeful glide. And always, the headphones. White, black, silver, gleaming in the autumn sun. A uniform of the serene. One afternoon, I tried to talk to Sarah, my sister, over a video call. She lived in Vancouver, a world away from my quiet street. "You look exhausted, Leah," she said, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. "I'm not sleeping well," I admitted. "There's this noise." I leaned my laptop's microphone closer to the wall. "Can you hear that? That buzzing?" She tilted her head. "I hear your laptop fan. Is it overheating?" "No, it's not the fan. It's in the walls. It's everywhere." My voice was tight with frustration. "Leah," she said, her tone shifting to the one she used when I was a teenager having a meltdown. "Maybe you need a break. From the house, from the work. The divorce was hard on you. Maybe you should come out to Vancouver for a couple of weeks. Get away from everything." "It's not in my head, Sarah." "I'm not saying it is," she said, which is exactly what people say when they think it is. "I'm just saying a change of scenery couldn't hurt." I ended the call with a flimsy excuse about a client deadline. I slumped back in my chair, the hum of the room pressing in on me. Daniel thought I was lonely. Sarah thought I was cracking up. Maybe they were right. Maybe the intricate, terrifying architecture of sound I was documenting was just the scaffolding of my own breakdown. My research grew more desperate. I plunged into the dark corners of the internet, my search history a litany of paranoia, mass auditory hallucination, urban frequency phenomenon, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, MK-ultra auditory signals, psychotronic weapons. I found forums filled with people who claimed the government was beaming signals into their brains through their dental fillings. It was all too outlandish, too steeped in tinfoil hat cliché. But then, buried deep in a subreddit called r/unexplained sounds, I found it. A post from 6 months ago. A user named Static on the Radio from a suburb of Portland, Oregon. Title: "Is anyone else hearing this? The hum has changed. I know about the Taos hum, the Windsor hum. This isn't that. I'm an audio guy, I live for sound. For the last few weeks, the electrical hum in my house has been different. It's not 60 Hz anymore. It's higher, more complex. And people here, they've all started wearing headphones. All of them. They say they like the quiet, but they look blank. Am I going crazy?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I frantically clicked on his profile. He had made 3 more posts, each more agitated than the last, describing the changing frequencies, the micro-power outages, the placid expressions. He was describing my life. His last post was 4 months old. The signal is clearer now. I think I understand what it wants. It's beautiful. After that, nothing. Silence. I sent him a private message, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "I hear it too. In Toronto. Please, tell me what you found." I hit send. And I waited. The silence from his account was more frightening than any noise. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. Entry 03, The Silent Congregation. The days bled into one another, measured not by the sun, but by the subtle modulations of the hum. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my studio, the glowing green line of the spectrum analyzer my only confidant. The message to Static on the radio remained unanswered. His digital ghost was a constant, unnerving presence, a harbinger of a fate I couldn't comprehend. The secondary mystery, the power outages, became my new focus. It was the only tangible thread I could pull. If the hum was the symptom, the grid felt like the disease. I dove into municipal records online, sifting through mind-numbing PDFs of city council minutes and public utility reports. It was a needle in a digital haystack. And then I found it. A line item in a budget proposal from Toronto Hydro. Approved 18 months ago with little fanfare. Phase 1 rollout of the Bethel Grid Smart Infrastructure. The name sounded like something from a fantasy novel. The description was a masterpiece of corporate jargon, a next-generation power management system utilizing dynamic frequency modulation to ensure network stability, optimize load balancing, and improve efficiency. Dynamic frequency modulation. The words leaped off the screen. They weren't just managing the flow of power, they were actively manipulating its frequency. The official documentation was sparse, citing proprietary technology and security concerns. But it mentioned pilot programs. The first suburb to be fully integrated was a test zone. My suburb. Etobicoke Lakeshore. I felt a cold certainty wash over me. This wasn't a malfunction. This was by design. The hum, the changing pitches, the reboots, it was the Bethel grid, performing its function. But what was that function? Network stability felt like a lie, a thin veil over something far more profound and disturbing. My diary entries became more focused, correlating the hum's patterns with real-world events. November 5th, 5:17 p.m. Garbage truck on street. Heavy diesel engine. Hum shifted, incorporated a low 80 Hz pulse for the 22 seconds the truck was audible. It's canceling, or harmonizing. A live mixing board for reality. November 8th, 9:02 p.m. Distant police siren. A perfect day natural. The hum responded instantly. A high-frequency overtone at 440 Hz bloomed and then faded as the siren passed. It's sampling its environment. Learning. The behavior of my neighbors was also evolving. The placid smiles and solitary walks were giving way to something more cohesive. One evening, drawn by an unnerving stillness, I looked out my front window. What I saw sent a tremor of pure, primal fear through me. On the lawns up and down my street, people were standing. At least 24 of them. Mark from next door. Mrs. Gable by her mailbox. The teenager with the purple hair. They were standing perfectly still, bathed in the orange sodium vapor glow of the streetlights. They were all wearing their headphones. And they were all facing the same direction, east, towards the silhouette of the Kipling electrical substation 2 kilometers away. They weren't talking. They weren't moving. They were just standing. A silent congregation worshipping a temple of transformers and power lines. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against the steady, invasive hum from my own walls. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to record it. But the low light and the distance rendered the figures as blurry, indistinct shapes. It was useless as proof. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, for what felt like an eternity. It was probably 10 minutes. Then, as if a silent bell had tolled, they all turned in near-perfect unison and walked calmly back into their houses. The street was empty again, as if nothing had happened. This was the escalation. This was the moment it tipped from a personal, psychological horror into a tangible, coordinated event. I was no longer just a paranoid woman hearing noises, I was a witness. I had to understand what the headphones were for. The initial theory, that they were blocking out the hum, was clearly wrong. If the hum was unpleasant, why would they congregate towards its source? The logic was backward. What if they weren't blocking something out? What if they were tuning something in? The thought was chilling. The headphones weren't a shield, they were an antenna. A focusing lens for the ethyl grid signal, delivering it directly to the user, pure and unpolluted by the distracting, messy sounds of the real world, the birds, the traffic, the voices of other people. I needed proof. Not a shaky video of blurry shapes in the dark, but something undeniable. I needed to know what happened when the signal was interrupted. I needed to get a pair of those headphones off someone. My target, I decided, would have to be Mark. He was close. He was predictable. And despite his newfound serenity, I still held on to a shred of memory of the kind, chatty man he used to be. My plan was simple and suicidally reckless. I'd wait for his recycling day ritual. Tuesday morning. He always brought his big blue bin to the curb at precisely 8:30 a.m. The morning arrived, cold and gray. I watched from my living room window, my stomach a knot of anxiety. I had my own headphones, a pair of noise-isolating studio monitors, but I didn't put them on. I needed my ears clear. I needed to hear everything. At 8:29, his garage door rumbled open. Mark appeared, pulling the blue bin behind him. He was wearing the same silver headphones, his face set in that familiar, peaceful mask. He wheeled the bin to the curb, the plastic wheels rattling on the asphalt. It was one of the few unfiltered, real sounds I'd heard all morning. My heart was in my throat. My body screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door and hide. But the image of the silent congregation on the lawn pushed me forward. This was it. I opened my front door and stepped outside. The cold air hit my face. Mark. I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy. He didn't turn. He was adjusting the lid on the bin, his movements precise and unhurried. I walked down my driveway, my footsteps deafening in my own ears. I was 20 feet away. 10. 5. I was standing right behind him. The air smelled of damp leaves and car exhaust. Mark. I said again, louder this time. I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. He stopped his movements but didn't turn. I felt the fine wool of his jacket under my palm. It felt so normal. Mark, can you hear me? I pleaded, my voice cracking. Slowly, he turned his head. His eyes met mine. They were calm, clear, and utterly vacant. There was no recognition in them. No surprise. It was like looking at a beautifully rendered but soulless animatronic. My resolve hardened. It was now or never. With a hand that trembled violently, I reached up. My fingers brushed against the cool, smooth plastic of his headphones. He didn't flinch. He just watched me with those placid, empty eyes. I took a deep breath and gently, but firmly, pulled one cup of the headphones away from his right ear. The world did not come rushing in. He did not gasp or cry out. The serene smile on his face didn't even flicker. For a single, heart-stopping beat, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the ever-present hum from the power lines overhead. Then, a new sound began. It came from Mark. From his own lips. It wasn't a word, or a gasp, or a cry. He began to hum. It was a perfect, pure tone. A clean, unwavering sine wave. There was no vibrato, no human imperfection. It was the sound of a machine. Using my years of ear training, my ingrained sense of perfect pitch, I recognized it instantly. It was the C sharp. The dominant 130.8 Hz frequency. He was replicating the signal. Flawlessly. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process what my ears were telling me. The headphones weren't just antennas. They were teaching aids. The hum wasn't a broadcast being sent to them. It was being absorbed by them. It was overriding them. He wasn't a man listening to a sound, he was an amplifier for it. I let go of the headphones. They snapped back into place over his ear. The humming stopped instantly. His serene smile remained. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod, then turned back to his recycling bin, his task complete. He walked back up his driveway and disappeared into his garage, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk, shaking in the cold morning air. The contagion wasn't social or psychological. It was replacement. A quiet, insidious firmware update for the human soul. And it was spreading, one placid smile, one set of headphones, one perfect, hummed note at a time. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Entry 04, the resonators. The revelation on the sidewalk outside Mark's house broke something in me. The neatly compartmentalized boxes of my problem versus the world's problem shattered. It was all one. The hum in my walls and the hum from Mark's lips were the same song, and I was the only one left in the audience. I retreated. My house became a fortress, my studio a panic room. I soundproofed it further, buying acoustic foam online and tacking it over the windows, blocking out the light and the sight of the silent, gliding figures outside. I lived in a dim, muffled cocoon, the spectrum analyzer my only window to the outside world. The green line was my enemy, my obsession, my only link to the truth. The nature of the threat was terrifyingly clear now. The ethyl grid wasn't for power efficiency. It was a carrier wave. The signal it broadcast was a blueprint, a set of instructions. The people, my neighbors, they were becoming living resonators. Their brains were being retuned, their consciousness hollowed out to make room for the signal. The headphones were the interface, a direct audio input that bypassed the chaos of normal sensory data, allowing for a clean installation of the new operating system. The peace and quiet they enjoyed wasn't the absence of sound. It was the purity of the one sound. The signal, unadulterated. The rest of the world was just noise, interference, static to be filtered out. My diary became a frantic attempt to understand the endgame. November 15th. Why? Why do this? Control. Pacification. A docile, compliant population is an old trope. But this feels different. It's not about controlling their actions, it's about replacing their essence. They aren't being suppressed, they are being repurposed. November 18th. The silent congregations are more frequent now. Almost every night at 9:15 p.m. I timed it. They faced the substation. Is it a download? A synchronization? Are they collectively strengthening the signal, acting as a distributed network of amplifiers? A choir singing a song only they can truly hear. My attempts to find allies had failed. Sarah now prefaced every conversation with, "Have you thought about talking to Dr. Sharma about this, Leah?" Daniel had stopped returning my calls altogether. The ghost of static on the radio from Portland remained a silent sentinel in my inbox. I was utterly alone. Or so I thought. One evening, deep in a rabbit hole of encrypted forums dedicated to infrastructure hacking, I found a post. It was different from the usual conspiracy chatter. It was technical, precise. The user, Cassandra_complex, was talking about the ethyl grid. They had identified its unique frequency hopping signature in 3 other cities, Portland, Oregon, Brighton, England, and a suburb of Austin, Texas. They were mapping its spread. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my heart pounding with a desperate, fragile hope. I wrote a carefully worded message, detailing my own observations in Toronto, the specific C# frequency, the power outage reboots, the coordinated behavior of the resonators, as I had started calling them. I didn't mention Mark humming. It felt too insane to commit to text, even on a secure channel. I didn't expect a reply. I expected the same digital void that had swallowed static on the radio. But 20 minutes later, a notification pinged. From Cassandra_complex. Subject, Ethel Grid, Toronto. You're a musician or an engineer. Your ear is good. The C# is the key signature of this regional network. Austin is in G-flat. Brighton is in A. They're creating localized fields. The reboots are firmware patches. The congregations are handshakes with the local node. You are in a hot zone. Be careful who you talk to. They are not who they were. How did you know about the resonators? The last question sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't used the word. Cassandra_complex had. It wasn't just my private, paranoid term. It was real. A cautious back and forth began. Cassandra, as they called themselves, was cagey about their identity, but their knowledge was undeniable. They were part of a tiny, scattered group of unreceptive individuals who, for reasons of neurology or simple vigilance, could perceive the signal but were not susceptible to its primary effects. They believed the Ethel Grid was not a government plot, but something else. Something corporate. Cassandra, look up a tech incubator called Ethel Corporation. They're a shell company for a much larger entity. They won the bids for municipal grid modernization in all the affected zones. Their CEO is a man named Julian Finch. A recluse. A visionary, they say. He believes human consciousness is inefficient. Too chaotic. He wants to streamline it. The idea was so monstrous, so audacious, it almost looped back around to being absurd. A tech billionaire deciding to roll out a global consciousness update because he found humanity too messy. It was the plot of a bad sci-fi movie. But the hum from my walls, the silent figures on the lawn, and the memory of Mark's machine-perfect note told me it was real. My alliance with Cassandra gave me a new, terrifying purpose. I was no longer just a victim, I was a field agent. I became their ears in Toronto. I upgraded my equipment, buying a portable recorder and a parabolic microphone. I started leaving my house again, not for groceries, but for reconnaissance. The world outside my foam-lined studio was worse than I had imagined. The contagion had spread beyond my quiet street. It was in the malls, on the subway, in the heart of the city. The placid faces and the ubiquitous headphones were everywhere. It wasn't a 100% infection rate, not yet. There were still people talking, laughing, arguing. But they were becoming the minority. The resonators moved through the city like a river, flowing around the rocks of the untuned, their movements synchronous, their paths efficient. They never bumped into each other. They navigated crowds with an eerie, collective grace. One afternoon, I sat in my car near the substation, my parabolic mic aimed at the chain-link fence. The air itself seemed to thrum with power. Through my headphones, I could hear the raw, unfiltered signal. It was a symphony of terrifying complexity. The C# was just the root note of a massive, ever-changing chord. Then, I saw a black sedan pull up to the gate. A man in a sharp suit got out, his face devoid of any headphone-induced serenity. He looked sharp, alert, and deeply unpleasant. He unlocked the gate and let himself in. I zoomed in with my phone's camera. It was a grainy image, but I could tell he wasn't one of them. He was one of the administrators. This was the escalation Cassandra had warned me about. The system was now being actively managed on-site. My temporary ally, my hope, was about to be tested. Cassandra asked me to do something that turned my blood to ice. Cassandra, there's a maintenance hub, a small building on the substation grounds. We need to know what's inside. There should be a terminal, a direct access point to the local node. If you can get close enough to get a photo of the screen, any screen, it could give us everything. The thought of getting inside that fence, of walking into the very heart of the sound that was destroying my world, was paralyzing. But what was the alternative? To sit in my foam-lined room until the signal finally breached my skull or they came for me. I agreed. The plan was set for the night of the next power outage reboot. During the brief window of the system being down, security would be at its weakest. It was my only chance. The night came. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised purple. I sat in my studio, watching the spectrum analyzer, my go bag at my feet, a change of clothes, cash, a burner phone, my audio recorder. At 2:13 a.m., it happened. The lights flickered. My monitors went dead. The green line on the analyzer vanished into blackness. Silence. The 5-second countdown began. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my bag, and ran. Outside, the world was pitch black and utterly quiet. It was the silence of the tomb. I sprinted down the silent street, my own gasping breaths the only sound in the universe. I reached the substation fence as the power surged back on. The streetlights buzzed to life, and the hum returned, washing over me like a physical wave. It felt stronger now, renewed. I found the spot in the fence Cassandra had identified from satellite images, a section weakened by rust. It took me 2 minutes of frantic pulling to create a gap big enough to squeeze through. I was inside. The main building was lit, impregnable. But the small maintenance hub was dark. Its lock was a simple keypad. Cassandra had given me a series of codes to try, probabilistic algorithms based on other Ethel installations. The first failed. The second. My hands were slick with sweat. On the third try, I heard a soft click. The door opened. The room was small, filled with humming server racks. In the center was a single terminal, its screen glowing with lines of code. It was exactly as Cassandra had described. My heart hammering, I raised my phone to take a picture. And then the light flicked on. I froze, caught in the sterile, fluorescent glare. Standing in the doorway was the man in the suit I had seen before. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't placid. His eyes were intelligent, and cold, and full of an unnerving calm. He wasn't a resonator. He was a collaborator. "Leah Halpern," he said. His voice was smooth, resonant. "We were wondering when you'd stop just listening and start trying to interfere." He took a step into the room. "Julian will be so pleased to meet you. He has a special interest in the outliers." My blood ran cold. They knew my name. They had been watching me. My alliance with Cassandra hadn't been a secret. It had been a baited hook. And I had swallowed it whole. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. Entry 05, The Root Chord. The man's name was Elias. He didn't restrain me. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his voice, the chilling finality of him knowing my name, was more effective than any pair of handcuffs. The hope I'd nurtured through my correspondence with Cassandra evaporated, leaving a cold, heavy dread in its place. Cassandra wasn't a fellow resistor. Cassandra was a net. "The network learns," Elias said, as if sensing my thoughts. He gestured to the server racks, the source of the symphony that had tormented me for months. "It flags anomalies. Unreceptive minds, active investigations into its infrastructure. It learns, and it adapts." It created the Cassandra persona based on profiles of disillusioned tech workers. It gave you exactly what you were looking for, a partner, a purpose. It led you right here. My confrontation wasn't with a monster or an alien. It was with an algorithm of terrifying sophistication, and its human custodian. I was led from the hub not to a police car, but to the black sedan. The drive was silent. Elias didn't speak, and I was lost in a fog of defeat. The quiet contagion, the pavement marks. Phase 1, The Unsettling Mundane. Tuesday. The word itself was gray and functional, just like the sky slumped over Stockport. I liked Tuesdays. Tuesdays had a rhythm. Pick up at the depot by 7 a.m., first drop at the Arndale, then the spiral out into the suburbs. Predictable. Safe. My van, a Ford Transit with 80,000 miles on the clock and a faint, permanent scent of cardboard and diesel, was my kingdom. Inside, I was king. The air freshener, a faded pine tree, always hung at a perfect right angle to the rearview mirror. The stack of delivery notes was always squared off, held down by a heavy maglite torch. My flask of tea sat in its holder, lid screwed on 3 full turns, no more, no less. This was my order, my small, manageable bulwark against the world's chaos. My name is Darren, I'm 24, and if a doctor ever bothered to look inside my head, they'd probably use the term obsessive-compulsive disorder. I just call it being careful. Checking the doors are locked 3 times isn't madness, it's thoroughness. Following the same delivery route isn't a compulsion, it's efficiency. People like Kev, my depot mate, they drift through life, leaving mugs on the edge of tables and doors unlocked. I don't know how they sleep at night. The first mark appeared on a Tuesday. It was outside the Ellington Court Flats, a grim 1970s block that always smelled of boiled cabbage and damp. As I swung the van door shut, my gaze snagged on it. There, on a grimy paving slab, was a chalk drawing. It wasn't the work of kids. There were no lopsided smiley faces or crude rockets. This was different. It was a set of 3 interlocking triangles forming a complex, larger triangle. The lines impossibly straight, the corners needle-sharp. The chalk was brilliant white against the greasy flagstone. It was perfect. I found myself admiring its precision. Someone with a good eye and a steady hand had been here. I took the parcel to flat 3B, got the scrawled signature, and forgot about it. The next day, Wednesday, I was back at Ellington Court with a package for a different flat. As I pulled up, I glanced at the spot where the triangles had been. It was empty. Not faded, not smudged, but gone. A faint dusting of white was all that remained, as if it had been meticulously brushed away. I shrugged. The council cleaning crew must have been by. But then, as I walked towards the main door, I saw another one. At the next junction of the pavement, maybe 10 meters from the first spot, was a new symbol, a perfect square with a tight, elegant spiral etched inside it. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, ran up my spine. It was the same stark white chalk, the same impossible precision. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. 2 perfect geometric drawings, in 2 different spots, on 2 consecutive days. My brain, the part of it that craves patterns, that needs A to connect to B, lit up like a pinball machine. You see that, Kev? I asked the next morning, as we were loading up. We were in the depot yard, the air thick with exhaust fumes and the clatter of roller doors. I pointed to the pavement just outside the main gate. A new one had appeared overnight. This one was a circle, bisected by a clean, jagged line, like a stylized lightning bolt. Kev, a man whose shape resembled a well-filled sack of potatoes, squinted. His face was a picture of amiable confusion. See what, mate? The chalk mark. On the curb. He leaned forward, his gut pressing against the side of the van. That bit of bird muck in it? It's not bird muck, Kev. Look at the lines. It's perfect. Right, he said, in that tone that meant he was humoring me. He patted a box. Well, this perfect box of bathroom tiles ain't gonna deliver itself. He saw nothing. Not just didn't care, but didn't see. His brain had looked at the symbol, failed to categorize it as thing that matters, and discarded the data. Mine couldn't let it go. It became my new obsession, a secret layer of the world only I seemed to notice. I started photographing them. My phone's gallery, once a barren landscape of accidental pocket shots and the odd picture of my mum's cat, became a catalogue of arcane geometry. A pattern of 7 dots arranged like a constellation outside the post office. A series of chevrons pointing towards the precinct entrance near Greg's. An intricate lattice of hexagons on the platform at Stockport Station. They moved. They were never in the same place for more than a day. And they were always pristine, as if drawn only moments before I saw them. I started to feel a strange, proprietary connection to them, as if they were messages left for me. But what were they saying? My routines, once a source of comfort, now felt like a framework for this creeping weirdness. Each familiar turn, each regular stop, became a chance to hunt for the next symbol. The OCD, the part of me that checked and rechecked, that aligned and ordered, found a new and terrifyingly vast project. I created a new folder on my laptop, pavement marks, and began sorting the photos by date and location, printing them out, trying to draw them on a map of the town. I tried to show my mum one evening during our nightly phone call. I sent her a photo of a particularly elegant one, a pentagram nested within a circle. "Mum, have you seen any of these around town? On the pavements?" There was a pause. "Ooh, that's nice, love," she said, her voice warm and completely missing the point. "Is it one of them pavement artists? For charity?" "No, Mum, they're different. They move." "That's clever. Anyway, you'll never guess what Maureen said down at the bingo." The conversation moved on. I was alone in this. The feeling wasn't just one of isolation, it was a deeper, more chilling feeling. It was the feeling of your own senses betraying you, or worse, of everyone else's senses failing them. Was I going mad? Was this what a breakdown felt like? A sudden, inexplicable obsession with meaningless pavement scrawls? I clung to logic. It had to be a viral marketing campaign. Some new app, or a band, or an art collective. Any day now, a poster would appear or a hashtag would start trending, and it would all make sense. I'd have a laugh at how worked up I'd got. Any day now. But the days turned into a week, then two, and there was no explanation. Only more marks. They started to feel less like art and more like something technical. Like blueprints. Or circuitry. One afternoon, delivering a small, heavy box to an office I'd never been to before, I saw the name on the directory. Geometrix Data Solutions. The name hit me like a physical blow. Geometrix. On the pavement outside their smoked glass entrance was a symbol I hadn't seen before, a simple, open-ended square, like a staple. It looked unfinished. An instruction waiting to be completed. I left the package at the reception desk. It was a sleek, minimalist affair of chrome and white plastic. The desk was empty, no clutter, not so much as a stray pen. The receptionist's chair was pushed in, perfectly aligned, its wheels forming a precise parallel with the edge of the desk. No one came to collect the package. I just left it there, on the cool, sterile surface, and backed away. That night, I lay in bed, the ceiling of my small room seeming to press down on me. The world outside my window, the familiar suburban silence, felt different. It felt like a stage on which a play was being set, the props moved into place by unseen hands, and I was the only one in the audience who could see them. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. My phone call with Mum was strained. I didn't mention the marks. I asked about her day, about the cat, about the leaky tap I needed to fix for her. The mundane details felt like an anchor, the only thing stopping me from drifting away. "Are you all right, love?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You sound a bit distant." "Just tired, Mum," I lied. "Long week. Get a good night's sleep, Darren. Don't you be worrying." But as I hung up, I knew it was too late for that. The worry was in. It had found the cracks in my carefully constructed reality and was seeping through, like damp through a cellar wall. Before I turned out the light, I went to the window and looked down at the pavement on my own street. For the first time, there was a mark there, directly under a streetlight. A single, straight white line, about a meter long. It pointed directly at my front door. I checked the lock. Once. Twice. 3 times. It wasn't enough. I wedged a chair under the handle before I finally got into bed, my heart hammering a frantic, irregular beat against my ribs. The rhythm was gone. Tuesday was broken. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The line outside my house was gone the next morning, vanished as cleanly as all the others. The relief I felt was thin and watery, immediately displaced by a new, sharper anxiety. It had been here. It knew where I lived. My world, once a grid of predictable routes, became a minefield. I started to see a logic to the marks, a terrifying, creeping logic. They weren't random. They mapped the arteries of the town, the paths people took. They were waypoints. The realization came to me during my morning run, a habit I'd kept for years, the same 3-mile loop every day. On a whim, driven by a flicker of paranoia, I took a different turn, cutting down a back alley I normally avoided. It was a grimy, rubbish-strewn path, but it cut a good minute off my time. Later that day, on my delivery route, I drove past the end of that same alley. There, freshly chalked on the pavement where the alley met the street, was a new symbol, 2 parallel lines joined by a diagonal slash. A detour sign. It felt like the system was correcting itself. It was tracking me. The isolation began to feel like a physical pressure, a constant ringing in my ears. I had to tell someone. I had to make them see. I cornered Kev during our lunch break, my hands trembling slightly as I held out my phone. Kev, look. Properly this time. I showed him a picture of the interlocking triangles. The first one I'd seen. This was outside Ellington Court 3 weeks ago. The next day, it was gone, and there was a different one. I swiped to the photo of the square and spiral. And they're everywhere. Don't you see? It's not normal. Kev chewed his cheese and pickle sandwich, his brow furrowed. He looked from the phone to my face and back again. It's a good drawing, I'll give you that, he said slowly. Look, mate, you're getting a bit wound up about this. It's just kids. Council cleans it off, they draw another one. It's the circle of life. He laughed, a short, barking sound. But they're perfect, Kev. And they move in a pattern. My voice was rising, bordering on frantic. Darren, he said, his tone softening, becoming pitying. Maybe you need a break. You've been doing a lot of overtime. The gaffers even noticed you've been. I dunno, a bit twitchy. He wasn't seeing. He was diagnosing. In his mind, the problem wasn't the impossible chalk marks, the problem was me. The chasm between us yawned wider. I was the frog in the slowly boiling pot, and not only was everyone else not screaming, they were telling me the water was lovely. My research became more desperate. I spent hours online, falling down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and urban art forums. I typed in every permutation I could think of, sentient graffiti, teleporting chalk marks, geometric language on streets. I found articles about ley lines, forum posts about alien surveyors, and endless videos of people pressure washing their patios. Nothing matched. There was no Pavement Artist Collective of Greater Manchester. No viral campaign for Geometrics Data Solutions. My digital breadcrumbs led nowhere. I started a physical journal, a thick A4 notebook. I printed the photos, taped them in with sellotape, and wrote down the date, time, and location of each sighting. I bought a large map of the town and began to stick colored pins in it, a different color for each day of the week. The map grew into a chaotic, multicolored sea of plastic heads. There was no grand pattern I could discern, only that they seemed to cluster around hubs of activity, the station, the market, the industrial estate where my depot was. And, I noted with a cold knot in my stomach, they followed my delivery routes with an almost perfect fidelity. The deliveries to Geometrics Data Solutions became a weekly occurrence. Each time it was the same, a small, surprisingly heavy box, the anonymous office building, the empty, sterile reception. I started lingering, hoping to see someone, anyone. I'd pretend to be checking my delivery scanner, my ears straining for the sound of a footstep, a cough, a ringing phone. Nothing. The silence in that building was absolute, a dead, processed silence that felt more unnatural than any noise. The receptionist's chair was always perfectly aligned. One week, I nudged it with my foot, just a few inches to the left. The next week, when I returned, it was back in its original position, perfectly parallel to the desk. Then the real horror started. It wasn't the marks anymore. It was the people. It began with Mrs. Higgins. She was a sweet old lady in her 80s, lived in a small terraced house, and always offered me a boiled sweet. I saw her walking towards the corner shop one afternoon. The shop was diagonally across a small village green from her house. A normal person would have cut across the grass. It was the most direct route, a desired path worn into the turf. But Mrs. Higgins didn't. She walked along the pavement to the corner of the green, executed a flawless 90-degree turn, walked the length of the green, and then performed another perfect right-angle turn onto the street with the shop. It was inefficient, robotic, and utterly bizarre. She walked as if following invisible lines on a blueprint. I thought it was a one-off. Maybe her arthritis was bad, maybe she was avoiding the damp grass. I rationalized it. But then I saw it again. A group of teenagers, the kind who usually slouch and swagger in a chaotic cluster, were walking down the high street. They moved in a staggered, linear formation, each one maintaining a precise, equal distance from the person in front, like a flock of migrating geese. They weren't talking or laughing. They just walked, their eyes fixed ahead, their steps synchronized. The sight was so profoundly wrong that I had to pull the van over, my heart thumping. The final piece clicked into place in the depot yard. I watched Kev walk from the canteen back to his van. Instead of taking a straight line across the tarmac, he followed a strange zigzag path, like a knight's move in chess. 3 steps forward, 2 steps right, 3 steps forward, 2 steps right. Kev! I yelled out the window. What are you doing, the scenic route? He turned, his face a mask of genuine bewilderment. What are you on about, mate? Just walking. He had no idea. No conscious knowledge of the bizarre, unnatural path his body had just taken. The marks weren't just marks. They were instructions. Code. A programming language for human movement. And people were starting to run the program. My paranoia found a new, sharper focus. I began watching people's feet. I'd sit in the van on my break, parked near the precinct, and just watch. And I saw it everywhere. A woman pushing a pram who would only step on the cracks in the pavement. A businessman who would only turn left at junctions. A pair of friends walking in perfect, mirrored step. It wasn't everyone, not all the time. It was subtle, a background hum of wrongness. But it was spreading. The fear that had been a vague dread now crystallized into a single, terrifying question: what happens if you follow the path? I started consciously avoiding them. I saw a new mark on the pavement ahead, a simple arrow pointing right, and I forced myself to turn left, my muscles screaming in protest as if fighting a current. I walked on the grass verges. I cut through car parks. I zigzagged across empty roads. My behavior became erratic. Strange. I was the one who looked crazy. In a world that was quietly, calmly conforming to a new set of rules, I was the bug in the system. The glitch. One afternoon, the depot gaffer, Mr. Harrison, a man with a face like a clenched fist, called me into his office. Kev was there, looking awkward and staring at his shoes. Darren, Mr. Harrison started, steepling his fingers. Kev here tells me you've been acting, unusually. And frankly, I've seen it myself. You're all over the place, son. Walking in funny patterns in the yard. Taking strange routes. Everything all right at home? I looked at Kev. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I'm fine, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to me. Just, got a lot on my mind. Well, get it off your mind and on the road, Harrison grunted. This is a logistics company. We're about getting from A to B in the most efficient way possible. We don't have time for interpretive dance. Straight lines, son. Remember that. Straight lines. The words echoed in my head as I walked out of the office. It was a threat. An ultimatum. But it was already too late. I didn't know what a straight line was anymore. I could only see the secret, crooked paths twisting all around me, and the terrifying, placid obedience in the eyes of everyone who walked them. I was the only one left fighting the current, and I was getting so tired. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. My mind, already predisposed to seeing patterns, went into overdrive. The connection was undeniable, the marks were the code, and the people were the processors. It was a quiet, insidious form of control, rewriting the most fundamental human instincts, how to walk, how to move through space. It wasn't a virus of the body, but of the world's operating system. I began to theorize, scribbling frantic notes in my journal. Was it Geometrix Data Solutions? Were they broadcasting a signal from their sterile, silent office? Was it some kind of psychotronic weapon, a frequency that resonated with the chalk symbols and influenced motor functions? Or were the marks themselves the source? Perhaps they weren't chalk at all, but some kind of nanotechnology, seeping into the ground and emitting a low-level directive that the human subconscious, lazy and eager for instruction, simply obeyed. The thought was terrifying, that free will was so flimsy it could be overridden by a doodle on a pavement. I started to experiment, a desperate, amateur scientist in a world-sized lab. I found a freshly drawn mark near a bus stop, a simple arrow pointing right, towards a side street. I parked the van across the road and watched. For 10 minutes, it was a normal scene. People got off the bus, milled around, went on their way. Then, a woman in a red coat reached the corner. She was heading straight on, I could tell from her posture. But as her foot neared the chalk arrow, she faltered for a split second, a barely perceptible twitch, then turned sharply right down the side street. 5 minutes later, a man talking on his phone did the exact same thing. He didn't even break his conversation, his body just changed direction as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I watched as 7 consecutive people, all of whom had been walking with clear intent, were diverted by the simple arrow. They were automata, following a command they didn't even know they'd received. The escalation came without warning. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was caught in traffic approaching the M60 roundabout at Portwood. It's usually a vortex of pure chaos, a testament to bad driving and frayed tempers. But as I sat there, something changed. The cacophony of horns and revving engines died down. I looked up and saw it. The cars on the roundabout, all of them, were moving in a perfect, concentric circle. A silver hatchback, a white van, a red sports car, and a lorry, all gliding around with the stilted, impossible grace of a computer simulation. They maintained exact distances, their speeds perfectly synchronized. It was beautiful, and it was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. The world was being choreographed. The spell lasted for maybe 45 seconds. Then, as if a switch was flipped, it broke. A horn blared. The lorry shuddered to a halt, the sports car swerved, and the normal, aggressive chaos of the roundabout resumed. People were shouting, shaking their fists. No one seemed to have noticed the moment of terrifying, unnatural perfection that had just occurred. They were just angry about the sudden traffic jam. I sat in my van, gripping the steering wheel, slick with sweat. This was bigger than just pedestrians. It was taking over the machines, too. My own behavior became more and more frantic. My fear of following the paths was absolute. It was a conviction, as solid and unshakable as a religious belief. If I let myself be guided by even one of the marks, if I walked one of the prescribed paths, I would be captured. My will would be subsumed, and I'd be trapped in a looping route, a perfect delivery circuit, forever. I would become another Kev, another Mrs. Higgins, my body going through the motions while whatever was left of me screamed from inside a locked room in my own skull. This meant my days became a series of absurd evasions. I'd park the van half on the pavement to avoid stepping on a mark near a curb. I'd walk through flower beds and duck under hedges. I looked like a madman, and the looks I got confirmed it. Kev started actively avoiding me, a pained expression on his face whenever I came near. "Boss is thinking of putting you on warehouse duty for a bit, mate," he mumbled one day, not meeting my eye. "Give you a rest from the road." They were trying to contain me. To put me in a box where my erratic movements wouldn't disrupt the emerging order. In my desperation, I turned back to the one place I'd found a glimmer of recognition, the internet. I spent a whole weekend scouring deep web forums, using search terms I hadn't dared to before: reality control, geometric consciousness, world path algorithm. And then I found it. A single, archived thread on a sub-forum dedicated to unexplained perceptual phenomena. The thread was 3 years old, started by a user named Pathfinder77. His first post sent a jolt through me. Subject: the Bristol maps. Anyone else seeing them? They started a few months ago. Chalk marks on the pavement. Perfect geometric shapes. They move overnight. No one else seems to see them. Or if they do, they don't care. But it's the way people are walking now. They're following patterns. Sticking to the paving stones, turning perfect right angles. Am I going crazy? It was my reality, mirrored perfectly, but in a different city, years ago. I devoured the thread. There were only a handful of replies, most of them dismissive. But Pathfinder 77 had persisted, posting updates for almost a year. He wrote about watching traffic flow in unison, about his colleagues developing strange, repetitive tics. He wrote about his growing isolation and fear. My hands were shaking as I created an account and sent him a message. I poured everything out: the marks in Stockport, geometrics, Kev, the roundabout. I felt a wave of catharsis, the sheer relief of unburdening myself to the one person in the world who might understand. I didn't expect a reply. The thread was ancient. But the next evening, an email notification popped up. "You have a new message from Pathfinder 77. My heart hammered. I clicked it open. I knew there had to be others. It's spreading. Listen to me. They aren't just maps. They are rewriting the world, one step at a time. Think of it like a new OS being installed over an old one. It's a non-human intelligence, I'm sure of it. Something seeping through. It doesn't communicate with words or ideas. It uses a more fundamental language, geometry. Pathways. The most basic concepts of existence. Don't follow the paths. Whatever you do, look for the gaps. The uncoded spaces. The places where the logic breaks. That's the only safe place." He understood. The relief was so intense it almost made me weep. I wasn't alone. I wrote back immediately, asking more questions. What was the source? How could we fight it? His reply came quickly. "I don't know. I have a theory it's nodal. It emerges in certain places and spreads from there. The fact you have a geometrics company is a big clue. That's probably your local node. We need to find out how many nodes there are. Can you tell me your exact location? Send me photos of the most complex patterns you see. I think I can use them to triangulate the source signal." I read the message, and a sliver of ice slid into my gut. The elation of finding an ally curdled into cold dread. He wanted my location. He wanted the patterns. He wanted data. He called himself Pathfinder. He talked about nodes and triangulation. His language was the language of the system. Was he a survivor, a fellow resistor? Or was he a trap? A lure, designed to find and neutralize glitches like me? A honeypot for the same. The name, Pathfinder. It was too perfect. Too on the nose. It was a name someone would choose to gain the trust of a man lost in a world of malevolent paths. The feeling of isolation came crashing back, 10 times worse than before. It wasn't just that I was alone, it was that the very concept of an ally was now suspect. Every helping hand could be part of the machine. With a trembling finger, I deleted my forum account, wiped the browser history, and threw my notebook, my precious journal full of maps and theories, into the bin. The evidence was a liability. The search for help was a trap. I was on my own again, and the enemy wasn't just on the pavement anymore. It was everywhere. It was in the helpful advice of a colleague, the concerned questions of a manager, and the friendly messages of a stranger on the internet. The contagion wasn't just rewriting paths, it was rewriting trust itself. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation didn't happen in a darkened alley or a sterile office. It happened on a Thursday morning, under the flat, unforgiving light of the depot yard. I arrived at 6:45 a.m., same as always, but as I drove through the gates, I hit the brakes so hard the van screeched. The entire car park, a vast expanse of cracked tarmac and faded yellow lines, was gone. In its place was a latticework. A sprawling, impossibly complex circuit board drawn in that stark, brilliant white chalk. It was the culmination of everything I had seen, a masterpiece of cold, alien geometry. There were spirals, hexagons, chevrons, and shapes for which I had no name, all interconnected by a web of pristine lines. And my colleagues were walking it. They moved like a silent, intricate ballet. Kev emerged from the canteen, and instead of walking towards his van, he took a sharp right, followed a curved line around a parking bay, walked a perfect pentagram on the spot, and then proceeded in a series of straight lines and abrupt turns. No one bumped into each other. Their paths weaved and flowed, a display of perfect, unconscious coordination. They were loading their vans, their movements stripped of all wasted motion, unervingly economical. An arm would extend to grab a box at the exact moment a space cleared. A foot would step into a vacant spot just as another colleague's path flowed away from it. It was the efficiency Mr. Harrison had talked about, taken to its terrifying, inhuman conclusion. I sat in the van, engine idling, a prisoner in my own mobile kingdom. I couldn't get out. To step out would be to step onto the grid. Kev saw me. He altered his path, flowing towards my van in a sequence of movements that felt both fluid and utterly wrong. He stopped by my window and smiled. It was a placid, distant smile, his eyes holding a serene emptiness I'd never seen in him before. "Morning, Darren," he said, his voice calm and even. "Mind the lines." He said it so casually, so normally. And with those 3 words, my world shattered. He acknowledged them. It wasn't a secret anymore. The program had finished installing. This was the new normal, and he was telling me, politely, to get with it. The contagion was complete. This place, my place of work, my routine, was the epicenter. I looked past him, at my own van, parked in its designated bay. To get to it, I'd have to cross at least a dozen lines. I'd have to follow a prescribed path. My terror from the past few weeks solidified into a certainty. If I stepped onto that grid, if I let it guide me to my van, the van would no longer be my sanctuary. It would be my prison. I would drive my route, a perfect, efficient loop, turning exactly where the arrows told me to turn, stopping where the circles dictated, a delivery drone made of flesh and blood, forever. The choice was stark, presented to me on a canvas of white chalk. Stay, and join the dance. Stay, and succumb to the beautiful, horrifying order. Or run. My eyes darted around the yard. The gate I'd driven through was the main entrance. But to my right, at the back of the depot, was a high, chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Beyond it was a tangle of overgrown brambles and weeds, the embankment of a disused railway line. A gap in the pattern. An uncoded space. Pathfinder 77's words echoed in my head. That's the only safe place. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was an instinct. The last sputtering flicker of the old, chaotic, inefficient human programming. I slammed the van into reverse, ignoring the placidly turning face of Kev, and swung the vehicle around, aiming it not at the gate, but at the corner of the depot building. I drove it onto the low curb, the chassis scraping with a hellish shriek, and jumped out, leaving the engine running, the door wide open. I ran. I didn't look back. I scrambled up the muddy embankment, my hands raw, my work trousers tearing on a snag of wire. I heaved myself over the fence, the barbs ripping my jacket, and tumbled down the other side into the thicket of nettles and forgotten things. I lay there for a moment, panting, stinging, heart hammering against my ribs. Cautiously, I peered back through the fence. No one was coming after me. No one had even seemed to notice my frantic escape. The ballet continued. Kev had already altered his path to flow around my abandoned, engine-running van. My dramatic exit was just another variable the system had effortlessly absorbed. I wasn't a glitch to be hunted down. I was just an error, already rounded down to zero. That was weeks ago. I don't know how many. I don't have a job, a phone, or a home anymore. I am a ghost in my own town. I live in the margins. The forgotten spaces Pathfinder 77 spoke of. I sleep in derelict warehouses down by the Mersey, in the shells of abandoned factories, and move through the town's forgotten circulatory system, overgrown canal towpaths, back alleys choked with rubbish, the desired paths across parks that no one uses anymore. From these hidden vantage points, I watch the quiet contagion. It has taken hold completely. The town is better, I suppose. There are no traffic jams. The buses run with millisecond precision. The crowds on the high street flow like water, parting and merging in silent, elegant streams. There is no crime, no shouting, no mess. The town has been perfected. It is orderly, efficient, and utterly inhuman. Sometimes I stand in the overgrown scrubland behind my mum's housing estate and look through her kitchen window. I watch her make a cup of tea. She moves in a tight, repeating loop. Kettle, mug, tea bag, fridge for the milk, sugar bowl. A series of precise, economic steps, repeated exactly the same way every time. There is no wasted motion. She never hums to herself anymore. I see Kev's van on the road sometimes. It drives with an impossible smoothness, turning corners without decelerating, slotting into traffic with a grace no human driver could manage. I wonder if he's happy, in his placid, empty way. I am free, but I am more alone than I have ever been. I am a man who remembers the chaotic, inefficient beauty of a world that no longer exists. I am a relic, trapped in the margins of a new, geometric reality. My life is governed by a new set of rules now. Never step on a pavement if I can help it. Never walk in a straight line. Never follow a path laid out by another. I survive by walking crooked, in a world that has been made straight. And every day, I watch the pavement, my heart in my throat, forever afraid of taking a single wrong step. Forgotten faces. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first time it happened, it was just a Tuesday. Tuesdays were my longest day, a gauntlet of 3 back-to-back classes of juniors feigning interest in the American experiment. The air in my classroom at Northfield High always smelled faintly of floor wax and teenage ennui. From my window, I could see the distant, jagged spine of the Rockies, a constant, silent reminder of a history far older and grander than the one I was trying to cram into 90-minute blocks. So, after the Emancipation Proclamation, I said, pacing in front of the whiteboard, the moral calculus of the war shifted entirely. For President Lincoln, this wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. A hand went up in the third row. It was Kevin, a lanky kid who usually just doodled superheroes in his notebook. Miss Evans? Who? I stopped pacing. President Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. Kevin blinked, his expression a perfect mask of polite confusion. Sorry. I don't know that name. A few kids snickered. I felt a familiar prickle of irritation. This was the intellectual lethargy I fought against every day. They knew the names of a dozen reality TV stars and SoundCloud rappers but couldn't place the man on the $5 bill. The 16th president, Kevin, I said, my voice a little tighter than I intended. Gettysburg Address. Tall guy, beard, top hat. Assassinated at Ford's Theater. I pointed to the portrait hanging above the smartboard, one of the legally mandated series of presidential pictures that adorned every history classroom in the district. Kevin's eyes followed my finger. He squinted. Oh. Him. Okay. He said it with the tone of someone finally recognizing a vaguely familiar extra from a movie. He didn't say the name. He just nodded and looked back down at his notebook, the moment of inquiry over. I let it go. It was a single instance of a student being spectacularly, almost willfully, ignorant. It was discouraging, but it wasn't an anomaly. It was just Tuesday. I finished the lesson, the name, Lincoln, feeling strangely heavy in my mouth each time I said it, as if I were over-enunciating a foreign word. The second time was a week later, in the teacher's lounge. It was a cramped, beige room that smelled of burnt coffee and microwave popcorn. I was grading papers, trying to decipher a particularly creative interpretation of the Reconstruction era. Sarah, who taught English next door, plopped down opposite me, dropping a stack of essays on the Great Gatsby onto the table. I swear, if one more kid tells me Gatsby's green light symbolizes money, I'm going to start assigning them the phone book, she groaned, rubbing her temples. Tell me about it, I sighed. I just had a student argue that the Civil War was mostly about states' rights to regulate agriculture. Sarah laughed. Oh, that's a new one. At least it's creative. Beats the usual stuff. You know, it was a different time, and that tall president with the hat had a lot on his plate. My red pen paused mid-correction. The tall president with the hat. I repeated, keeping my voice casual. Yeah, you know. The one from that war. She waved her hand vaguely. Mr. Stovepipe. I don't know. My brain is fried. I've been reading about Daisy Buchanan's vapid angst for 5 hours straight. Lincoln, I said. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Sarah looked at me, her head tilted. Yeah. Right. Lincoln. Whatever. Point is, they don't get nuance. She grabbed a stale donut from the box on the counter and took a bite. The conversation moved on. But I didn't. I sat there, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Sarah was sharp. She wasn't Kevin. She knew American history. For her to fumble that name, to use the same strange, generic descriptor as a disengaged 17-year-old, it felt wrong. Like a tiny crack appearing in a solid wall. You can tell yourself it's just the plaster settling, but you can't unsee it. I tried to rationalize it. It was a meme, probably. Some dumb TikTok trend where they pretended to forget famous people. Or maybe it was just a strange coincidence, a shared brain fart between a teacher and a student. People misspeak all the time. I did it myself. I was 31, single, and my main source of social interaction was arguing about historical causality with teenagers. Of course I was overthinking things. My life in Denver was stable, routine, predictable. I lived in a small apartment in Capitol Hill, close enough to walk to the park. I had my morning coffee at the same cafe, I ran the same route around Cheeseman Park, I graded papers on my balcony overlooking the quiet street. My life was a series of repeating patterns, and this was just a data point that didn't fit the curve. It was noise, not signal. I resolved to ignore it. For a few weeks, I succeeded. Life was normal. The students were their usual mix of brilliant, baffling, and bored. Sarah and I complained about the administration and shared lesson plan ideas. The mountains stood sentinel in the west, their snowy peaks catching the morning sun. Everything was fine. Then came the unit on the civil rights movement. This was my passion. This was history that was still alive, its echoes shaping the very world these kids lived in. I started the lesson with his face, the iconic black and white photograph projected onto the screen. A face of determination, of grace, of righteous fury. Today, I began, my voice filled with the reverence I always felt when speaking his name. We're going to talk about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Silence. Not the respectful silence of anticipation. It was a blank, empty silence. 25 pairs of eyes stared at the screen, then at me, with polite, questioning apathy. "Dr. King," I prompted. "I have a dream." The Montgomery bus boycott. The March on Washington. A girl in the front row, a bright student named Maya who was usually my star participant, raised her hand tentatively. "I'm sorry, Miss Evans. I think you might have the name wrong." My blood ran cold. Wrong? How? "The guy who did all that," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration, "his name was Martin Luther. You know, like the German guy. The one who started that church. I did a paper on him in middle school. He was an important American activist." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Several students nodded. "Yeah, Martin Luther," someone said. "That sounds right." "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "No, that's not right. Martin Luther was a German theologian in the 1500s. Martin Luther King, Jr. was the American civil rights leader." I felt like I was speaking a different language. They looked at me with a sort of gentle pity, the way you'd look at an elderly relative who'd gotten a story mixed up. Maya even gave me a small, sympathetic smile. "I think you're getting them confused, Miss Evans," she said, her tone unnervingly calm and reasonable. "It's an easy mistake to make." My heart was hammering against my ribs. I looked from their placid, confident faces to the powerful image of Dr. King on the screen. The contradiction was so profound, so jarring, it made me feel dizzy. "Everybody, take out your phones," I commanded, my voice sharp with a rising panic. "Look him up. Right now. Martin Luther King, Jr." They complied, a sea of glowing rectangles appearing on the desks. I watched them, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I saw them typing, swiping, their expressions unchanging. Kevin looked up first. "It says here Martin Luther was a prominent 20th century American figure," he read from his phone, his voice flat. "Known for his speeches on social harmony." What? I strode over to his desk and looked at his screen. He was on the Wikipedia page. The title at the top read, "Martin Luther, Activist." The birth and death dates were correct for Dr. King. The photo was of Dr. King. But the name, everywhere in the text, was simply Martin Luther. The King and Jr. were gone. Erased. I stumbled back, grabbing my own phone from my desk. My fingers trembled as I typed the name. The same results came up. Page after page, article after article. Martin Luther, the American activist. I clicked on a link to a video of the "I Have a Dream" speech. The title on the video was Martin Luther's Dream Speech. "See?" Maya said gently. "It happens. Memory is a tricky thing." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I looked at the presidential portraits on the wall. Lincoln was still there, his solemn gaze fixed on something beyond the room. But when I looked at him, for a terrifying, gut-wrenching second, his name was a ghost in my mind. A shape without a sound. I had to force it. Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. The effort was physical, like pushing against a heavy, unseen door. I dismissed the class early, my head pounding. I told them to read the chapter in the textbook, a chapter one now dreaded to open. I slumped into my chair, the silence of the empty room pressing in on me. I stared at the wall, at the face of the man who freed the slaves, and I felt a terror so profound it was almost silent. This wasn't a meme. This wasn't a coincidence. This was wrong. The world was quietly, calmly, confidently wrong. And I was the only one who seemed to notice. That night, sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of a library where all the books had blank spines, and a city where all the street signs had been replaced with the same indecipherable symbol. I walked through the familiar streets of my Denver neighborhood, but all the statues in the parks were faceless, their plaques scraped clean. I woke up in the pre-dawn darkness, the image of those smooth, blank faces burned into my mind. My apartment, usually a refuge, felt alien. I looked at my bookshelf, packed with history tomes, and a wave of nausea washed over me. Were they changing, too? Was the ink rearranging itself when I wasn't looking? I pulled down a heavy biography of Franklin D. Roosevelt, my hands shaking. I flipped it open. The name was there. The facts seemed right. But my confidence was gone. I was reading the words, but a part of my brain was braced for them to dissolve into nonsense. The rational part of my mind, the teacher, the historian, was screaming for an explanation. It had to be me. Stress. Burnout. A neurological event. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. It was far more likely that my own mind was failing than the entire world's collective memory was being rewritten. I decided to perform an experiment. A control group. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, lived in the apartment across the hall. She was 87, a widow, but her mind was a steel trap for the details of her life. She'd lived in this building for 50 years. She could tell you who lived in every apartment, when they moved in, when they moved out, and what scandals they were involved in. Her memory was her anchor. I knocked on her door, a plate of cookies in my hand as a pretext. She let me in, her apartment a museum of a life well lived, filled with doilies, antique furniture, and dozens of framed photographs. "Michelle, dear, how lovely," she said, her voice a fragile, papery thing. Come in, come in." We sat in her living room, and I asked about her late husband, Frank. She loved talking about Frank. "Oh, he was such a handsome man," she said, her eyes drifting to a large, colorized wedding portrait on the wall. "Built this whole city, you know. He was a foreman for the construction company that put up half the buildings downtown in the 60s. "I remember you telling me," I said, my heart starting to thump. "Frank was his name, right?" Mrs. Gable looked at the picture, her brow furrowed in a way that was eerily similar to Maya's in my classroom. She squinted. A long, painful silence stretched between us. "You know," she said finally, her voice thin with confusion. "That's funny. I can see his face clear as day, but the name, it just flew right out of my head." She laughed, a tiny, embarrassed puff of air. "Oh, the silly things that happen when you get to be my age. It'll come back to me." She looked at the photograph of the man she had loved for over 60 years, and his name was gone. And she wasn't horrified. She wasn't panicked. She was mildly amused, as if she'd misplaced her reading glasses. I left her apartment, the cookies untouched on her coffee table. I went back to my own unit and locked the door, leaning against it as my legs gave way. This wasn't my mind failing. Or if it was, I wasn't the only one. It was happening to her, too. The forgetting wasn't just about history books and famous men. It was personal. It was seeping into the foundations of people's lives, dissolving the names of their own husbands, their own heroes. It was a contagion of quiet, creeping emptiness. And it was spreading. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The next few weeks were a slow-motion nightmare. I became a collector of gaps, a connoisseur of forgotten things. I started a journal, a cheap spiral notebook I kept hidden under the loose floorboard in my closet. I wrote down every instance, every slip, every conversation that ended in that placid, confident wrongness. The notebook became my only confidant, its pages filling with my frantic, spidery handwriting. October 12th, in the faculty meeting, Mr. Henderson, physics, referred to Albert Einstein as that German fellow with the crazy hair who came up with the relativity thing. No one blinked. I wanted to scream Einstein. His name was Einstein, but the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, my throat tight. October 17th, a student's essay on World War II. It's well written, but it refers to the British Prime Minister as the cigar-smoking leader throughout. Not once does it mention Winston Churchill. I marked it down. The student, Jessica, came to see me. She was genuinely confused. But that's who he was, she insisted. Everyone knows that. October 24th, Sarah was talking about her trip to England. She mentioned visiting the famous writer's theater. I asked her if she meant the Globe. Whose theater? She asked. I said, Shakespeare's. She just laughed. Who? No, just the old theater. You know the one. She didn't know the name. William Shakespeare. The name had evaporated. My attempts to point out the discrepancies became more and more disastrous. I learned to stop correcting people. The first few times, I was met with confusion. The next few times, with pity. Soon, I began to see a flicker of something else in their eyes, suspicion. I tried to talk to Sarah again, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to find an anchor in my old reality. We were at a coffee shop near Washington Park. The autumn leaves skittering across the pavement outside. Sarah, I need to ask you something serious, I began, my voice low. Have you noticed, people forgetting things? Specific things. Names, mostly. She took a sip of her latte, eyeing me over the rim of the cup. You mean like where they put their keys? All the time. I think it's the gluten. No, I insisted, leaning forward. I mean important names. Like, historical figures. She set her cup down. Her expression shifted from friendly concern to something more clinical. Michelle, we've talked about this. You were worried about the Lincoln thing, remember? You've been under a lot of stress. It's not stress. It's real. Today, I went to the school library to check the encyclopedias. The W volume for Churchill. It's gone. Just, not there. The librarian said they hadn't had it for years. But I used it last semester. Okay, so they lost a volume of the encyclopedia. This is a public school, Michelle, not the Library of Congress. Things get lost. Her voice was soft, reasonable, and it was the most terrifying sound in the world. But it's not just that. It's everything. We don't talk about Churchill anymore, or Shakespeare, or Martin Luther King, Jr. It's like they've been edited out. And no one notices but me. My voice cracked. I could feel the sting of tears. Sarah reached across the table and put her hand on my arm. Hey, she said gently. I think you should consider talking to someone. A professional. All this focus on the past, maybe it's getting to be too much. It's okay to need help. Her hand felt like a brand. She thought I was losing my mind. The chasm between us was suddenly immense, uncrossable. I was on one side, with my panicked memories of a world that was fading, and she was on the other, in a comfortable, simpler reality where encyclopedias got lost and tired teachers just got names mixed up. I pulled my arm away. You're right, I lied, forcing a weak smile. I'm sorry. I'm just tired. Overworked. Of course you are, she said, her relief palpable. We all are. The conversation was over. My isolation was complete. I was officially the crazy history teacher who couldn't handle the pressure. My paranoia bloomed like toxic algae. I started to suspect patterns everywhere. I spent hours online, diving into conspiracy forums and fringe websites, searching for anyone else describing what I was seeing. I found scattered, fragmented posts. A user on a Reddit thread asking, "Does anyone remember a president with a big mustache? Roosevelt?" before the thread devolved into jokes about Teddy Ruxpin. A comment on a YouTube video, "I swear this band used to have a different name." But these were ephemeral clues. When I'd go back to find them, the posts would be deleted, the users vanished. It was like trying to catch smoke in my hands. The anomaly began to warp my own senses. Sometimes, when looking at a crowd, the faces would seem to smooth over for a fraction of a second, their features becoming generic, indistinct. I'd blink, and they'd resolve back into normal, unique individuals, but the afterimage of that blankness would haunt me. The hum of the fluorescent lights in my classroom started to sound like whispers, just on the edge of intelligibility. I'd catch myself trying to decipher them, straining to hear a message that wasn't there. This was when I started paying more attention to Mrs. Gable's subplot. It was no longer just about her husband's name. It was small things at first. She'd always been a meticulous gardener, her balcony a riot of colorful geraniums and petunias. One afternoon, I saw her out there, watering her plants. "Your flowers are looking beautiful, Mrs. Gable," I called over. She looked at the vibrant red blooms of her geraniums, her face clouded with a familiar, vague confusion. "Thank you, dear," she said. "I do love my red ones." She couldn't name them. Geraniums. A word she must have said 1,000 times. The specific was eroding, replaced by the general. It wasn't just people being forgotten, but things, concepts. A few days later, I helped her carry her groceries up from her car. Inside her apartment, I saw she had started doing something strange. On the wall where the dozens of family photos had been, there were now only a few. The wedding portrait was still there, but many of the smaller frames were gone. In their place, she had begun to stick yellow sticky notes. On a note where a picture of a young boy used to be, she had written, simply, "My son." Where a photo of her and Frank on vacation once hung, the note read, "A trip to the beach." I stared at the wall, my grocery bag slipping from my grasp. "Mrs. Gable, what happened to the pictures?" "Oh, it's just tidier this way," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Too much clutter. It's easier to remember the important things this way." Easier to remember. She was actively participating in the erasure. She was curating her own memories, stripping them of their specificity because the details were becoming too difficult, too slippery to hold on to. The empty spaces on her wall were more terrifying than any monster. They were voids, vacuums where a life's worth of specific, cherished moments used to be. The subplot of her fading memory wasn't a subplot at all, it was a glimpse of the endgame. My own mind became a battleground. Teaching was agony. I clung to my lesson plans like a life raft, but the names felt increasingly alien. I'd be talking about the Roaring Twenties, and for a split second, I couldn't remember F. Scott Fitzgerald. The name would vanish, leaving a gaping hole in my lecture. I'd have to pause, my heart pounding, and force the memory back into place. The effort left me drenched in sweat, my students looking at me with growing concern. They were used to my passion, my energy. Now I was hesitant, stumbling, lost in my own subject. One day, I was walking home, my mind a swirl of fear and confusion. I cut through Cheeseman Park, the sun low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass. That's when I saw it. The shadow of the large marble pavilion ahead of me wasn't right. It was too long, too sharp, and for a horrifying instant, it seemed to bend at an impossible angle, twisting back on itself before snapping back to normal. I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at the pavilion's shadow, now perfectly ordinary, stretching away from the setting sun. Had I imagined it? Was this the next stage? Hallucinations? The environmental warping the fringe forums whispered about. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the shadow, convinced that if I looked away, it would twist again. I hurried out of the park, the familiar cityscape of Denver suddenly feeling like a facade, a thin stage set that could tear open at any moment. That night, I opened my journal. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely write. November 5th, it's not just memories anymore. It's the world itself. Saw a shadow bend in the park. Impossible geometry. Am I going mad? Or is the world? What's the difference? Mrs. G has replaced her family with sticky notes. She called them clutter. We are all becoming clutter. The details are being swept away. I tried to remember my own grandfather's face today. For a second, I couldn't. I had to find a photo. I stared at it for 10 minutes, repeating his name. Leo. 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 Just to make sure it would stick. I was trapped. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't trust my own senses. My research led to dead ends and madness. My job, my passion, was now a source of daily terror. The quiet contagion had pushed me to the very edge of my own reality, and left me utterly, terrifyingly alone. The world was forgetting, and I was being forced to watch, the sole, unwilling archivist of a history that was vanishing like breath on a cold Denver morning. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The shadow in the park was a turning point. The anomaly was no longer just a passive erasure, it was actively distorting the fabric of my world. My focus shifted from merely documenting the forgetting to trying to understand its mechanism. Was this a mass delusion? A virus? Or was reality itself as pliable as Mrs. Gable's memory? My investigation grew more frantic, more reckless. The school library and mainstream internet had failed me. So I delved deeper into the web's dark corners. I learned about esoteric concepts, noospheric degradation, mimetic decay, chronoclastic agents. Most of it was paranoid fantasy, but woven into the gibberish were threads that resonated with a terrifying familiarity. They spoke of a great smoothing, a phenomenon that eroded unnecessary informational complexity from the collective consciousness to reduce reality friction. The theory was that history, with its sharp edges, its inconvenient heroes, and its painful truths, created a kind of drag on the forward momentum of the universe. The solution? A slow, systematic sanding down of those edges. It was insane. But it was the only theory that fit. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about streamlining. The world wasn't breaking down, it was being optimized. The names weren't just disappearing, they were being replaced with simpler, more generic placeholders. The tall president with the hat was more efficient than Abraham Lincoln. The cigar-smoking leader was less complex than Winston Churchill. The contagion wasn't a sickness, it was an upgrade. This horrifying reframing of the phenomenon changed everything. The affected weren't victims. They were the ones who had successfully installed the new operating system. I was the one running legacy software, full of bugs and obsolete data. The stakes escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't violence or overt aggression. It was subtler, more insidious. The affected individuals, in their shared, placid reality, began to exhibit a strange sort of unconscious coordination. It started in my classroom. During a silent reading period, I looked up and saw that 5 students, sitting in different parts of the room, were all tapping their pens on their desks. That wasn't unusual. But they were tapping in the exact same rhythm. A slow, complex pattern, tap tap, tap, tap tap tap. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, for nearly a minute. They were perfectly synchronized, completely unaware of each other. Then, as one, they all stopped. This synchronicity began appearing everywhere. In the cafeteria, a dozen people would lift their forks to their mouths at the exact same instant. At a crosswalk, a group of strangers would all turn their heads to the left at the same precise angle, like a flock of birds. They weren't zombies, they were just attuned. Connected to some silent, invisible metronome that I couldn't hear. When I saw it happening, I felt a profound, physical exclusion, like being the only person in a room who can't hear the music everyone else is dancing to. This was when I thought I found an ally. His name was David, and he was an adjunct professor of sociology at the University of Denver. I found him through a blog he wrote, a dense, academic exploration of social memory vacuums. It was the closest thing I'd found to a sane, rational discussion of the phenomenon. He didn't talk about aliens or conspiracies, but about the way societies collectively discard and modify their own histories. I emailed him under a pseudonym, my message cautious and vague. To my shock, he replied within an hour. He agreed to meet. We met at a dive bar on Colfax, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and regret. David was in his late 40s, with weary eyes and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. He looked exactly like a man who spent his life thinking about things no one else cared about. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. "You mentioned mimetic erosion," he said, after I'd haltingly explained my experiences with the names. He didn't look at me with pity or suspicion. He nodded, as if I were confirming a long-held hypothesis. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling with relief. "It's like the concepts themselves are becoming threadbare. People aren't just forgetting the name, Shakespeare, they're losing the entire framework that makes the name significant." "Exactly," he said, leaning in, his eyes alight with intellectual fire. "It's a semantic collapse. The signifier detaches from the signified. But what you're describing, the speed, the uniformity, that's something else. That's not a natural process." He explained his theory. He believed it was a side effect of technology, a kind of cognitive feedback loop created by our hyperconnected world. Our brains, overwhelmed with information, were creating shortcuts, offloading memory to the cloud. The cloud, in turn, was being curated by algorithms designed for efficiency, not accuracy. These algorithms were smoothing out the data, removing redundancies, simplifying complex figures into easily digestible archetypes. "The algorithms are forgetting," he said, staring into his beer, "and we, who have outsourced our memory to them, are forgetting right along with them. We're syncing with a corrupted cloud." It was a terrifyingly plausible explanation. It was technology, not metaphysics. It was a bug in the system. And maybe, just maybe, it was something we could fight. For a week, David was my lifeline. We met several times. I showed him my journal. He showed me his research, his data on trending search terms, demonstrating how specific historical queries were plummeting while generic ones, who was the leader of England during the war, were spiking. We were two lonely scholars, trying to map the contours of our dissolving world. But my hope was short-lived. Our alliance was tested in the cruelest way possible. We were in his university office, a chaotic space overflowing with books and papers. He was showing me a chart on his computer. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a graph. "A sharp decline in searches for John F. Kennedy starting 3 months ago. But look what correlates, a spike in searches for the president who was shot in the car." My eyes were on the chart, but my attention was snagged by something else. A book on his desk. It was a biography I recognized. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. But the author's name on the spine read H. Zimmer. "David," I said slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. "Who wrote that book?" He glanced at it. "Oh, that? H. Zimmer. Brilliant revisionist historian. A bit controversial." My blood turned to ice. "His name is Howard Zinn," I said, my voice a whisper. "Zinn." David frowned at me. It was the look. The same gentle, pitying look Sarah had given me in the coffee shop. The look that said I was confused, mistaken, broken. "No, I'm quite sure it's Zimmer," he said patiently. "I've sighted him a dozen times. Are you feeling all right, Michelle?" I stared at him. The man who understood semantic collapse, who saw the data, who had given me hope. He was infected. He was part of it. His own intellectual framework, the very tools he was using to analyze the contagion, were being built on its corrupted data. He was trying to diagnose the disease using infected instruments. I stood up, backing away from his desk. "I have to go," I mumbled, my heart shattering. "Michelle, wait," he called after me, his voice full of that same, terrible, reasonable concern. "Let's talk about this. Maybe you're just tired." I fled his office, running down the empty university hallway. My one ally wasn't an ally. He was just another ghost, a man haunted by a history he thought he knew, his own memory quietly and efficiently patched by the system he was trying to expose. The escalation became personal, intimate. The forgetting was no longer just out there, in the world, it was clawing at the doors of my own mind more insistently. I started leaving notes for myself around my apartment, just like Mrs. Gable. On my bathroom mirror, "Your name is Michelle Evans. You are a history teacher." On my fridge, "Abraham Lincoln. 16th President. Remember him." But the notes started to feel foreign. The name Abraham Lincoln would look, for a moment, like a random jumble of letters. I had to read it over and over, forcing the association, rebuilding the neural pathway each time. The effort was exhausting. It felt like holding a single candle against a hurricane. The final, terrifying insight into the nature of the threat came from Mrs. Gable. I checked on her one afternoon and found her sitting in her armchair, staring at the wall where the wedding portrait used to hang. The portrait was gone. In its place was a single, large sticky note. On it, in her shaky handwriting, were the words, "A happy day." "Mrs. Gable," I whispered, my throat constricting. "Where is the photograph?" She turned to look at me, her eyes placid and empty. "It's too much, dear," she said, her voice barely audible. "The faces. It's easier not to have to remember the details. The feeling is what's important, isn't it? It was a happy day. That's all that matters." That's when I understood the true horror. The contagion wasn't just erasing facts. It was erasing the need for facts. It was replacing the specific, complex, often painful texture of reality with a smooth, generic, emotional wash. It was trading memory for mood. And the most terrifying part was that it felt good. It was a relief. A release from the burden of history, of identity, of love and loss. It was the peace of utter emptiness. I looked at Mrs. Gable's calm, untroubled face, and I saw the future. I saw a world where no one was burdened by the past, because the past no longer existed. A world without heroes or villains, without triumphs or atrocities. Just a series of vague, pleasant, happy days. It was a world without shadows, without friction, without meaning. And it was winning. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't a battle. It was a surrender. It happened during parent-teacher conferences, a night I usually dreaded for its mundane anxieties about grades and student behavior. This year, it was different. This year, it felt like the final act. I was sitting at my desk, the classroom dimly lit, the presidential portraits looming like silent, forgotten gods on the wall behind me. I'd been through a dozen conversations, all of them surreal. Parents would talk about the importance of learning from the past, without being able to name a single historical event. They praised my dedication to teaching their children about the people who made our country, but their eyes were vacant when I mentioned Thomas Jefferson or Susan B. Anthony. They were all fluent in the language of appreciating history, but they had lost the vocabulary of history itself. My last appointment was with the parents of Kevin, the boy who had first asked, "Who?" all those weeks ago when I'd mentioned Lincoln. Mr. and Mrs. Davies were pleasant, earnest people. They were worried about Kevin's grades. "He's just not connecting with the material," Mr. Davies said, his brow furrowed with sincere concern. "We try to help him. We tell him how important it is to learn about, you know." He gestured vaguely at the room around him, at the invisible weight of the past. "All the figures. The important people," Mrs. Davies added, nodding emphatically. "The ones who did things." I looked at them. Two decent, caring parents, grappling with the same formless void as their son. They knew something important was missing, but they no longer had the words for what it was. "Who, for example?" I asked. My voice was quiet, devoid of the challenge or panic it once would have held. I was just curious now. An anthropologist observing the last moments of a dying culture. Mr. Davies opened his mouth. He looked at his wife, who looked back at him, a flicker of shared confusion passing between them. He turned back to me, a helpless, apologetic smile on his face. "Well, you know. The big ones. From the events." In that moment, in that shared, helpless silence, I saw the full, horrifying scope of it. The contagion wasn't a hostile invasion. It was a creeping, collaborative fog. It wasn't erasing memory, it was offering an escape from its weight. And people were accepting the offer. They were letting go. The struggle to remember names, dates, and faces was exhausting. It was so much easier to remember the feeling, the vague impression. It was easier to live in a world of the tall president and the guy who did the speeches. I saw my own future laid out before me. I could keep fighting. I could spend the rest of my life as a lonely sentinel, screaming names into the wind that no one could hear. I could clutch my journal, my crumbling encyclopedias, my increasingly fragile memories, and live as an outcast in my own time. I could be the last person who remembered Lincoln, and then, when I was gone, the last ember of that memory would wink out forever. Or I could let go. I could accept the peace of the smoothed-out world. I could stop fighting the current and just float. The choice wasn't made with a grand, dramatic decision. It was a quiet untensing of a muscle I didn't even realize I'd been clenching for months. I looked at the anxious, well-meaning faces of Kevin's parents, and I felt a wave of something that was almost compassion. "You're right," I said, and my voice was calm, soothing. It was Sarah's voice. It was David's voice. It was the voice of the new reality. The specific names aren't what's important. It's the big ideas. The lessons we learn about community and progress. That's what I'm trying to focus on with Kevin. The relief on their faces was instantaneous and profound. "Exactly." Mr. Davies beamed. "The big picture. That's it." I had given them the answer they wanted. I had validated their emptiness. And in doing so, I had taken my first step across the chasm. The walk home that night was different. The long, sharp shadows no longer seemed menacing, they were just abstract patterns on the ground. The hum of the streetlights wasn't a secret language, it was just a sound. The familiar streets of Denver didn't feel like a facade. They just were. The anxiety that had been a constant hum beneath the surface of my life for months was fading, replaced by a strange, hollow tranquility. I went to my apartment and walked to the closet. I pulled up the loose floorboard and took out my journal, the frantic archive of my own sanity. I flipped through the pages filled with names: Lincoln, King, Churchill, Shakespeare, Roosevelt, Zinn. The ink looked stark and aggressive on the page. The names themselves felt heavy, needlessly complex. Burdens. I walked to the kitchen, dropped the notebook into the metal trash can, and lit a match. I watched the pages curl and blacken, the names dissolving into smoke. I wasn't destroying evidence. I was liberating myself. Underscore 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 underscore. 6 months later. The air in my classroom smells the same, but I don't notice it anymore. The view of the Rockies is still there, but I rarely look at it. My lessons are different now. Smoother. We talk about broad movements, about eras and ideas. We discuss the era of expansion, the age of industry, the push for equality. We learn about the role of strong leaders in times of crisis and the importance of innovative thinkers in moments of change. The students are more engaged. The concepts are simpler, easier to grasp. There are no difficult names to memorize, no complicated legacies to debate. The presidential portraits are gone. One day, a maintenance crew came and took them down, replacing them with calming, generic landscapes. A forest scene. A placid lake. A mountain vista. Everyone agreed it made the room feel more open and positive. Sarah and I are closer than ever. We laugh about how stressed I used to be, how I'd get bogged down in the tiny details. She was right. I just needed to learn to see the big picture. Today, a student named Amy raised her hand. "Miss Evans," she asked, "in that big war between the states, who was the leader of the country?" I paused. For a fleeting, phantom second, an image ghosted through my mind, a tall, somber man with a beard and haunted eyes. A name, like a forgotten word on the tip of my tongue, flickered and died. The effort to grasp it felt unnecessary. A distraction. I smiled at Amy. A calm, placid, easy smile. "That's not what's important," I said, and the words felt true, they felt right. "What's important is that the country was divided, and a leader helped bring it back together. It's a story about unity." She nodded, satisfied, and wrote it down in her notebook. I turned back to the front of the room, to the empty space on the wall where his picture used to hang. I feel nothing. No loss. No panic. Just a quiet, clean slate. The world is so much simpler now. So much lighter. The forgetting is complete. It is not a void. It is peace. The quiet contagion, the smell of earth. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My name is Kenji Tanaka, though in the grand ledger of Kyoto, my entry is a minor one. At 46, my life is a well-tended garden, orderly, predictable, and quiet. I am a salaryman, a cog in the vast, humming machinery of a logistics firm in the city center. Each morning, I join the river of dark suits flowing into the train station. Each evening, I flow back out. My apartment, a modest two-bedroom on the ground floor of a modern but unremarkable building in a sleepy suburban ward, is my sanctuary. It is here, in the small patch of land allotted to me, my 10-square-meter canvas, that my real life unfolds. My garden is my pride. It is not one of the sprawling, ancient gardens for which Kyoto is famed, the kind that whispers of emperors and monks. Mine is a humble affair, a miniature landscape of meticulous design. A single, gnarled plum tree, which I have coaxed into a shape of pensive grace, anchors the composition. Beneath it, a carpet of Solirolia moss, impossibly green, is broken by a path of carefully selected river stones. I have a stone lantern, a shushurodoshi whose gentle, rhythmic clack marks the passing of quiet hours, and a curated selection of hostas and Japanese forest grass. It is a world of greens and grays, of texture and form. It is controlled, peaceful, and mine. The rest of my life is similarly arranged. I am unmarried, childless. My parents passed away years ago, leaving me with a modest inheritance and a profound appreciation for solitude. My colleagues know me as Tanaka-san, reliable, efficient, quiet. They do not know about the plum tree. They do not know how I can spend an entire Saturday patiently plucking individual weeds from the moss with a pair of long-nosed tweezers. They do not need to. My two worlds, the gray world of the office and the green world of my garden, coexist without overlap. This precise balance, this carefully constructed piece, began to tilt on a Tuesday in late May. It was a day like any other, sealed in the recycled air of the office, staring at spreadsheets that charted the movement of goods I would never see. The air in our office has a specific non-smell, a blend of sterilized air conditioning, faint ozone from the photocopiers, and the clean, papery scent of laser printer toner. But that afternoon, I caught another scent. It was faint at first, easily dismissed. A rich, loamy odor. The smell of freshly turned, damp earth. The kind of smell that clings to your hands after an hour of repotting, the smell of life and decay held in perfect balance. I lifted my head, sniffing the air like a deer sensing a change in the wind. No one else seemed to notice. Ida-san, 2 desks over, was methodically clicking her mouse, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. My manager, Ito-san, was on the phone, his voice a low, urgent murmur. I told myself it was my imagination. A phantom scent, perhaps, triggered by a stray thought about the weekend's gardening chores. A scent memory, as they call it. I had been planning to aerate the moss bed. My mind must have simply conjured the aroma in anticipation. I lowered my head and returned to my work, the numbers on the screen swimming for a moment before snapping back into focus. But the smell persisted. It wasn't constant, but it would drift back in waves, an olfactory ghost in the machine of the office. It was so vivid I could almost feel the cool grit of soil under my fingernails. By the time I left for the day, I had a dull headache from trying to ignore it. On the train home, crammed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the smell returned, stronger this time. It cut through the cacophony of perfumes, sweat, and city grime. It was absurd. I was in a sealed metal tube, hurtling beneath the city, yet I smelled a freshly plowed field. I glanced at the man beside me, a construction worker whose boots were caked in dried mud. That must be it. It was him. A simple, logical explanation. The relief was so immediate it felt like a sip of cool water. I relaxed my shoulders and focused on the rhythmic sway of the carriage. When I stepped out at my station, however, the scent followed me. It clung to me as I walked the familiar 15 minutes home, past the convenience store with its chime-like welcome, past the small park where mothers watched their children play. If anything, it grew more potent in the open air, as if the breeze were carrying it directly to me. It was clean, pure, almost primal. The smell of creation. Back in my apartment, I dropped my briefcase and went straight to the sliding glass door that opened onto my garden. I slid it open, expecting the real scent of my own small world to either overwhelm the phantom or merge with it. But as I breathed in the evening air, fragrant with the subtle perfume of my hosta leaves, I realized the intrusive smell was different. My garden smelled of care, of balance. This other smell was wilder, more elemental. It was the scent of a forest floor, of a new grave, of something ancient and hungry. I checked my shoes. Clean. I checked my suit trousers. Immaculate. There was no rational source. Shaken, I closed the door, the clack of the lock sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I decided to take a long, hot shower, to scrub the city and this persistent, phantom scent off my skin. The next few days were a quiet battle between my senses and my reason. The smell was my constant companion. It was there when I woke up, a faint earthy presence in my bedroom. It was in my morning coffee, a bizarre undertone to the rich bitterness of the brew. It permeated the sterile environment of my office, making it feel fecund and alive. I began to worry. Was this a medical condition? A phantasmia, a hallucination of the olfactory nerve? The initial stages of a brain tumor, perhaps? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I was a man of routines and predictable outcomes. The idea of my own body betraying me, of my senses lying, was deeply terrifying. I started observing others more closely, searching for any sign that they shared my experience. On Thursday, I saw Ida-san wrinkle her nose and murmur something to the woman at the next desk. My heart leaped. "Do you smell that?" I asked, a little too eagerly. Ida-san turned to me, her expression blank. Smell what, Tanaka-san? That, earthy smell. Like soil. She gave a small, polite laugh. No. I was just telling Mariko-san that someone's microwaved fish again. She turned back to her colleague, dismissing me with the gentle finality of her posture. The flush of embarrassment was hot on my cheeks. I was the strange one. The man who smelled imaginary dirt. My isolation deepened. The world continued on its axis, oblivious to the fact that, for me, its fundamental scent had changed. It was like living in a house where a single floorboard always creaked, but you were the only one who could hear it. At first, it's a nuisance. Then, it's a mystery. Finally, it's a sign of madness. It was that weekend that I first noticed the change in my neighbor, Mr. Sato. He lived in the apartment directly above mine, a retired pensioner who had always kept a few sad-looking geraniums on his balcony in chipped plastic pots. Our interactions were limited to polite nods in the hallway. I knew him as a man who watched television at a slightly too loud volume and shuffled when he walked. On Saturday morning, I was in my garden, trimming an errant branch on the plum tree, when I heard a scraping sound from above. I looked up. Mr. Sato was on his balcony, but he wasn't shuffling. He was moving with a strange, focused energy. He had thrown out his old geraniums and was now systematically smashing their plastic pots with a hammer. After breaking them into small pieces, he swept them into a dustpan and disappeared inside. He returned a few minutes later, dragging a large, heavy-looking sack of what I recognized as premium gardening soil. It was far better quality than anything his sad geraniums had ever known. He hoisted it onto the railing with a grunt and sliced it open with a knife. Rich, dark soil cascaded onto his balcony floor, forming a large, steaming pile. The scent that wafted down to me was overwhelming. It was the smell, amplified, undeniable. It was so strong my eyes watered. For the rest of the day, Mr. Sato worked. He didn't use planters or pots. He began to build a low wall around the edge of his balcony using stacks of old magazines and books, sealing the cracks with duct tape. He was turning his entire balcony into one giant, shallow planter box. He moved with a silent, relentless purpose that I found deeply unsettling. He didn't stop for lunch. He didn't seem to notice the sun beating down on his bald head. When his wife came out to say something, he didn't even look at her. He just continued patting down the soil with his bare hands, his movements rhythmic and hypnotic. She watched him for a long moment, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern, before retreating back inside. I tried to rationalize it. A new hobby. A retirement project. Perhaps he had been inspired by my own garden, though he had never commented on it. But his intensity felt wrong. It wasn't the joyful puttering of a hobbyist, it was the grim, single-minded work of a man under a compulsion. That evening, as darkness fell, I could still hear him moving around up there. Soft sounds. A rhythmic patting. The gentle scrape of a trowel. I sat in my darkened living room, the shushurodoshi in my garden marking the time with its lonely clack. The smell of earth was thick in the air, a miasma that had seeped through my walls from Mr. Sato's strange new project. It was no longer just my phantom. It was real. It had a source. And it was living right above my head. For the first time, the quiet satisfaction I drew from my orderly life felt fragile, like a thin layer of topsoil over something dark and churning. The creaking floorboard was no longer just in my head. Someone else was beginning to hear it, too. Or rather, they were starting to dance to its rhythm. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The following week, the world began to smell of soil. The phantom had become reality, an atmospheric fact I could no longer question. Walking to the station, the scent rose from the pristine pavement as if from a freshly tilled field. On the train, it was a constant, earthy breath against the sterile chill of the air conditioning. At work, it was a low, humming note beneath the office chatter, a smell of loam and roots that nobody else seemed to register. My attempts to validate my experience grew more desperate and, consequently, more furtive. Ito-san, I'd say to my manager, feigning a casual observation. The air feels quite damp today, doesn't it? Almost, loamy. He would glance toward the window, then back at his monitor. Just the humidity, Tanaka-san. A storm is coming, perhaps. But no storm came. The weather remained stubbornly clear and bright. My colleagues moved through their days with an unnerving normalcy, their senses apparently deaf to the olfactory revolution happening around them. I was living in a different sensory reality, a castaway on an island of smells that only I could perceive. My journal, once a place to record gardening notes and quiet reflections, became a logbook of my creeping dread. May 28th, the smell is in my food. I bought a bento box from the convenience store. The rice, the fish, the pickled vegetables, they all tasted faintly of dirt. Not an unpleasant taste, not rotten. Just, earthy. Like a radish pulled straight from the ground. I ate it all. I was hungry. May 29th, Mr. Sato has started talking to his balcony garden. I heard him this morning, his voice a low, cooing murmur. He wasn't using words, just sounds. Soft, guttural noises. When I left for work, I saw that tiny green shoots were already pushing through the soil he'd laid down. The speed is unnatural. My focus began to narrow, my world shrinking to the confines of my apartment building and the street it occupied. The wider city, with its millions of oblivious souls, felt distant and unreal. My neighborhood was where the change was taking root. Mrs. Kobayashi from 3B, a young mother with 2 boisterous children, had always struggled to keep a row of potted pansies alive by her doorway. This week, the pansies were gone. In their place was a mound of dark, rich soil piled directly against the concrete foundation of the building, held in place by a makeshift border of children's building blocks. She was on her knees beside it when I came home on Wednesday, her hands plunged deep into the dirt. She wasn't planting anything. She was just holding the soil. Her face wore an expression of deep, placid contentment. "Kobayashi-san," I said, my voice tight. She looked up slowly, her eyes unfocused. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Tanaka-san. Good evening." "That's a lot of soil," I managed. "Yes," she said, a serene smile touching her lips. "It's what the space needed. It was so empty before." Her children were sitting on the nearby steps, watching her in silence. They weren't playing or fighting as they usually did. They were just watching, their expressions as blank as their mother's. The isolation was becoming a physical pressure. At work, I found it hard to concentrate. The numbers and logistics charts felt absurd, meaningless abstractions compared to the fundamental, earthy reality that was asserting itself back home. I felt disconnected from conversations, my contributions faltering. People started to look at me differently. Tanaka-san, once just quiet, was becoming strange. He stared too long. He sometimes sniffed the air. I began to research online, my search terms growing more frantic. Mass olfactory hallucination. Psychogenic illness linked to smell. Environmental toxin causing phantasmia. The results were all clinical, detached, describing case studies in different countries under different circumstances. Nothing matched the specificity of my experience, the creeping, behavioral component. Nothing explained Mr. Sato's manic balcony farm or Mrs. Kobayashi's dirt worship. Then I started searching for local forums, neighborhood message boards. I posted anonymously. "Has anyone else in the Fushimi ward noticed a strange smell lately? Like damp earth?" The post received no replies. I checked it hourly, a compulsive tick. Nothing. It was as if I were shouting into a void. The secondary mystery, the one that began to truly unravel my composure, started not with a smell, but with a sound. It was a soft sound, late at night, when the city had finally fallen quiet. At first, I thought it was the plumbing in the old building. A soft, rhythmic scraping. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It seemed to be coming from below. From the floor. My apartment was on the ground floor, built on a concrete slab foundation with a crawlspace beneath for pipes and wiring. The sound was faint enough that I could convince myself it was a rat, or the building settling, or the water heater in its last throes. I put a pillow over my head and willed it to stop. But it didn't. Night after night, the sound returned. Scrape, pause, scrape. It was methodical. It sounded like digging. My carefully tended garden, my place of peace, now bordered this zone of unsettling activity. One afternoon, I stood over my perfect moss, my prize, and felt a tremor of fear. The shushurodoshi fell, clack, and for a second, I imagined the sound was coming from underground. My anxiety drove me to seek out the building's superintendent, Mr. Tanaka. The shared surname had always been a point of minor, unspoken amusement between us. He was a gruff but reasonable man in his late 60s who had managed the building for 20 years. I found him sweeping leaves near the bicycle racks. "Tanaka-san," I began, trying to sound calm. "I apologize for bothering you." "Kenji-san," he grunted, not stopping his work. "What is it?" "I've been hearing a strange noise in my apartment. At night. It sounds like digging. Under the floor." He finally stopped sweeping and looked at me. His eyes, usually sharp and impatient, seemed clouded. And I saw, for the first time, that his fingernails were rimmed with black. Not grease. Soil. "Digging?" he repeated, his voice flat. "Yes." A scraping sound. I thought perhaps it was a pest problem. Or something with the pipes in the crawlspace. He stared at me for a long moment. A slow, unnerving smile spread across his face. It was not his usual gruff expression. It was serene, distant. It was Mrs. Kobayashi's smile. "There is no problem, Kenji-san," he said, his voice soft. "It is just the house settling. Finding its proper place." "Settling doesn't sound like digging," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "It's a very specific sound." "All things find their level," he said, the smile never leaving his face. He then turned his back to me and resumed sweeping, the conversation clearly over. The leaves he was sweeping were dry and brittle, but he moved the broom with the slow, deliberate motion of someone spreading soft soil. I walked away, my heart pounding. He hadn't just dismissed me. He had lied to me with the placid confidence of a priest. He was one of them. The contagion, if that's what it was, had claimed the building's guardian. That evening, the situation escalated. On my way home, I saw that the small patch of manicured grass in the park had been partially dug up. Clumps of turf lay discarded on the pavement like shed skin. In the center of the muddy patch, a small group of people were on their knees, their hands moving through the soil. They weren't planting. They weren't speaking. They were just sifting. A man in a business suit, his jacket folded neatly beside him. A young woman in a trendy dress. An elderly couple. Their faces, illuminated by the setting sun, were calm, beatific. I hurried past, my gaze fixed on the ground. I didn't want to see their eyes. Back in my building, the change was more pronounced. New piles of soil had appeared along the walls of the corridor, small offerings outside every third or fourth door. The air was thick and heavy with the smell of earth, so potent it felt like breathing in dust. I saw Mr. Sato on his balcony again. He had what looked like a sapling now, in the center of his dirt-filled space. But it wasn't a species I recognized. It was pale, almost luminous in the twilight, and it seemed to have grown a foot since that morning. I locked myself in my apartment. The familiar comfort of my space was gone, replaced by the feeling of being in a besieged outpost. I went to my journal, my hands shaking. June 5th, Tanaka the superintendent is affected. He lied to me. The park is being dug up. There is dirt in the hallways. I don't know what to do. The digging sound has started again. It's louder tonight. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It feels closer. The rhythm is not random. It is the rhythm of a heartbeat. A slow, deep heartbeat, right beneath my feet. I pressed my ear to the floorboards of my living room, right over the spot where the sound seemed loudest. I closed my eyes, filtering out the distant city noise, the hum of my own refrigerator. Thump scrape, thump scrape. It was a heartbeat. And woven through it, another sound. A soft, wet, tearing noise. The sound of roots pushing through soil. The house was not settling. It was being undermined. It was being integrated. My garden, my sanctuary of order, now seemed like a foolish affectation. A single, pristine page in a book whose other pages were being rapidly filled with a chaotic, alien text. The shushurodoshi fell. Clack. The sound was a mockery of the peace I had tried to cultivate. I went to the sliding glass door and looked out at my little kingdom of green and gray. In the faint light from my living room, I saw something. A line in the perfect carpet of moss. A raised ridge, no thicker than my thumb, running from the edge of my patio foundation and disappearing under the plum tree. It hadn't been there yesterday. With a trembling hand, I slid the door open and stepped out into the earthy-smelling night. I knelt down, my knees sinking into the damp moss. I touched the ridge. It was firm, but yielding. I pressed harder, and my fingers broke through the surface. Underneath the moss, the soil was loose, freshly disturbed. And in that soil, I felt it. A root. It was thick, pale, and pulsed with a faint, slow rhythm against my fingertips. It felt warm. Alive. I snatched my hand back as if burned. The root was not from my plum tree. It was coming from under my apartment. The digging wasn't just digging. It was growth. And it was already in my garden. My sanctuary had been breached. The isolation was absolute. I was no longer an observer of the quiet contagion. I was living at its epicenter. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery of the root changed everything. The anomaly was no longer a matter of strange smells and unsettling behavior, it was a physical invasion. My carefully maintained world had been breached from below. The following days passed in a haze of paranoid vigilance. I stopped going to work, calling in sick with a vague, persistent flu my manager accepted with an unnerving lack of questioning. My time was spent charting the invasion. Each morning, I would find new root ridges under the moss, a subterranean vascular system spreading across my garden with horrifying speed. They were all thick and pale, like diseased veins, and they all pulsed with that same slow, warm beat. The plum tree, my stoic centerpiece, began to look distressed. Its leaves, once a vibrant green, were tinged with a sickly yellow. It was being starved from below, its own root system crowded out by this aggressive, alien growth. The neighborhood was transforming at a similar pace. What had started with Mr. Sato's balcony and a few piles of dirt had become a full-blown obsession. The small green spaces between buildings were now churned earth. Residents had torn up the decorative paving stones in the courtyard, piling them into crude walls to contain more soil. They worked together in a strange, silent harmony, a colony of ants tending to a singular purpose. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their faces serene, their hands perpetually caked in dirt. Their lawns, once neat patches of grass, were now home to the same pale, rapidly growing flora I'd seen on Mr. Sato's balcony. These plants were wrong. Their leaves were too broad, their stalks too thick, and they grew with a cancerous vigor, sometimes inches in a single day. At night, they seemed to glow with a faint, internal phosphorescence. The digging beneath my floor became a constant, rhythmic companion. Thump scrape, thump scrape. It was the house's new heartbeat. Sometimes I would feel a vibration through the soles of my feet, a deep resonance as if something truly massive were shifting in the earth below. My apartment, once a fortress, now felt like a raft on a churning sea. My research grew more esoteric. I abandoned searches for known medical conditions and began delving into obscure ecological and mycological theories. I read about vast, underground fungal networks, subterranean intelligences that connect entire forests. I read about slime molds, single-celled organisms that can exhibit collective problem-solving behavior. I read fringe theories about terrestrial panspermia, of alien life not arriving from the stars, but emerging from deep within the earth itself. The words on the screen swam together, forming a terrifying mosaic. Was this a fungus? A kind of terrestrial coral reef, using humans as its polyps to build and tend? A parasite that didn't infect the body, but the mind, rewriting instinct and purpose? I needed to see what was happening underneath the house. The crawlspace access was a small, grim-looking metal plate in the back of a utility closet. It was bolted shut. It took me the better part of an hour with a rusty wrench from my toolbox to loosen the bolts, my knuckles raw and bleeding by the end. The final turn of the screw released a puff of air from the opening. It was not stale or musty. It was a concentrated blast of the smell. Rich, damp, and overwhelmingly vital. It was so potent it made me dizzy. Armed with a powerful flashlight, I pulled the plate aside and peered into the darkness. The beam cut a sharp cone through the black. The ground below was a tangled mat of the pale, thick roots, glowing faintly even outside the main beam of my light. They pulsed in unison, a slow, hypnotic rhythm. They covered everything, wrapping around pipes and electrical conduits, which they seemed to ignore. The source of the digging was immediately apparent. At the edges of the crawlspace, the earth was being actively churned. Not by shovels, but by the roots themselves. Their tips were hard and pointed, like sharpened bone, and they moved with a slow, screwing motion, boring into the compacted earth, pulling it back, expanding their domain. The thump scrape was the sound of this relentless, organic excavation. My flashlight beam traced a particularly thick root, a central artery, back toward the center of the crawlspace, directly under my living room. It led to a large, bulbous mass half buried in the earth. It was a nexus, a heart. It was the size of a small car, and its surface was a swirl of pale, fleshy tissue and knotted roots, all pulsing with a slow, steady light and a deep, resonant rhythm that vibrated through the very foundations of the building. My heart hammered against my ribs, trying to match the alien beat. This was the source. This was the engine. I slammed the access plate shut, the metal screeching in protest. I hammered the bolts back in, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the wrench. I stumbled back from the closet, my mind reeling. This wasn't a contagion. It was a colonization. An ecological takeover from below, and the people of my neighborhood were its willing, happy gardeners. Desperate, I thought of Professor Ando, my old botany professor from university. He had been an eccentric, a man fascinated by the stranger corners of the plant kingdom, carnivorous plants, parasitic fungi, extremophiles. He had retired years ago, but I'd kept his old contact information. He was my last hope for a rational, scientific perspective, a life raft of sanity. After 3 failed attempts where my call went to voicemail, he finally picked up. Endo-sensei. I stammered, my voice hoarse. It's Kenji Tanaka. I was a student of yours, 15 years ago. There was a long pause. Tanaka-kun, he said finally, his voice thin and reedy. The boy who could identify any fern by its spores. I remember. What trouble have you found yourself in? I poured out the story, the words tumbling over each other. The smell, the neighbors, the unnatural plant growth, the digging, the roots under my house. I expected disbelief, concern, perhaps a recommendation for a good psychiatrist. Instead, he just listened. When I finished, the line was silent for so long I thought he had hung up. Endo-sensei. Are you there? Fascinating, he breathed, his voice filled not with alarm, but with a chilling, academic excitement. Truly fascinating. The scent profile you describe, the behavioral modification of the hosts, the accelerated growth and bioluminescence of the flora. It's a classic rhizomatic colonization event. The primary organism, the heart as you call it, likely communicates via airborne pheromones or spores, triggering a symbiotic response in susceptible fauna. In this case, humans. Symbiotic? I choked out. They're destroying everything. They're tearing up the streets. Destroying, Tanaka-kun. Or preparing. Clearing the way. Tilling the soil. You of all people should understand. You cannot make a new garden without pulling up the old weeds. The asphalt, the concrete, they are weeds, from the organism's perspective. A cold dread washed over me. He wasn't helping me. He was analyzing. What is it? What do I do? Do? He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. You observe. You document. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to witness a fundamental ecological shift. A new kingdom of life asserting its dominance. I've been waiting for something like this my whole life. I have some contacts at the university, we could. People are losing their minds. I shouted into the phone. My home is being consumed. The individual is irrelevant in the face of such a beautiful, biological imperative, Tanaka-kun, he said, his voice now cool and distant. You are witnessing the birth of a new world. I envy you. Take detailed notes. Record everything. He hung up. The click of the disconnected line was the sound of my last tether to the old world being severed. I was utterly, completely alone. There was no one to call, no authority to appeal to. How could I explain to the police that a giant, pulsing root heart under my building was turning my neighbors into zombie gardeners through a phenomenal gestalt? They would lock me away. The threat was no longer abstract. It was personal. The next morning, I looked out my window to see Mr. Sato, Mrs. Kobayashi, and even Tanaka the superintendent standing at the edge of my garden. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at my plum tree, at my pristine moss. They stood perfectly still, their hands hanging at their sides, palms open. In each hand was a handful of the rich, dark soil from their own plots. An offering. Or an invitation. They stood there for an hour, a silent, unnerving vigil. They were waiting for me to let them in. They wanted to improve my garden. They wanted to rip up my careful composition of moss and stone and plant their pale, phosphorescent weeds. They wanted to connect my small, orderly patch to the larger, chaotic network that was consuming the neighborhood. My garden was the last bastion of the old world on this street. And they had come to till it. The stakes had escalated from a personal struggle for sanity to a territorial defense. But I had no weapons, only a trowel and a pair of pruning shears. And my enemy wasn't an army. It was a garden, and its gardeners who believed, with every fiber of their being, that they were bringing paradise to earth. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The siege was silent and absolute. Day after day, a small contingent of my neighbors stood at the edge of my property. Their numbers grew. Soon, there were a dozen of them, then 20, a silent congregation of the converted. They stood from sunup to sundown, patient as mountains, their faces empty of malice but full of a terrifying, singular purpose. They held out their offerings of soil, of strange, pulsating seed pods that seemed to writhe with a life of their own, and the pale, thick roots that they had pulled from the ground, still pulsing with that slow, steady beat. They never tried to cross the low stone border of my garden. It was a line they seemed unable or unwilling to trespass without invitation. But their presence was a constant pressure, a psychological weight that crushed the air from my apartment. The smell of earth was now so thick that it coated my tongue, a constant taste of minerals and damp decay. The digging beneath the floor was no longer a secret whisper, it was a groan that shuddered through the foundations, making glasses rattle in my cupboards. The floorboards in the living room had begun to warp, bowing upwards from the pressure of the growth beneath. My sanity was fraying, shredding like old cloth. Sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of being buried in warm, soft earth, of roots twining through my limbs and filling my mouth, of my own consciousness dissolving into a vast, silent, green awareness. I would wake up gasping, the phantom taste of soil in my throat. I was a prisoner in my own home, the last man on an island that was shrinking with every passing hour. My meticulously ordered life, my pride and my defense, had collapsed into this. A single, terrified man, watching the world he knew be peacefully, placidly dismantled and replanted. The confrontation came on the 7th day of the vigil. The sky was overcast, casting the world in a flat, gray light that made the pale, glowing plants in the neighboring plots seem even more alien. The digging beneath the house intensified to a frantic, violent shuddering. A loud crack echoed through the apartment as a floorboard in the living room finally split open. From the splintered wood, a single, thick, white root tip emerged, questing blindly in the air of my home. It pulsed. Thump. 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 It was the end. The invasion was no longer external. The house was breached. I looked from the questing root in my living room to the silent assembly outside my window. Their faces, upturned towards my apartment, were filled with a look of serene expectation. Mr. Tanaka, the superintendent, stood at their forefront. He had changed the most. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy texture, and his eyes, fixed on my window, glowed with a faint, phosphorescent light, mirroring the alien plants around him. He took a single step forward, placing one bare foot onto the perfect moss of my garden. The line had been crossed. A primal fear, cold and sharp, cut through my paralysis. Flee. The word was a clang of alarm in my mind. I couldn't stay. I couldn't fight. I could only run. Ignoring the root in the living room, I scrambled to my bedroom, stuffing a few essentials into a backpack, my wallet, my passport, a bottle of water. My hands shook so violently I could barely zip the bag closed. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to leave this place behind, to find a place where the air still smelled of asphalt and exhaust fumes, a place that was still sane. I went to my front door, my hand hovering over the lock. But where would I go? Professor Ando's words echoed in my mind. A rhizomatic colonization event. Was this just my neighborhood? My city? Or was it happening everywhere, a quiet, creeping transformation that most people wouldn't even notice until their own hands were plunged into the soil? The thought of escaping, only to find the contagion waiting for me at my destination, was a horror beyond comprehension. A sudden, jarring silence fell. The frantic digging beneath the house stopped. The constant, shuddering vibration ceased. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening. Then came a new sound. A soft, wet, tearing noise, coming from the living room. Drawn by a morbid compulsion, I crept back to the doorway and peered in. The single root that had breached the floorboard was no longer questing. It had grown, thickened, and now it was splitting open down its length. From the pale flesh within, something was unfurling. Not leaves. Not branches. It was a flower. But it was like no flower I had ever seen. Its petals were translucent, veined with a faint, pulsing light. And at its center was not a pistil and stamen, but a perfect, miniature replica of my own plum tree, rendered in glowing, ethereal light. I stared, mesmerized. It was beautiful. Horrifyingly, impossibly beautiful. And as it unfurled, it released a puff of pollen, a cloud of fine, glittering dust that hung in the air of my living room. I held my breath, but it was too late. I inhaled. The scent was no longer just soil. It was a complex perfume of damp earth, of night-blooming jasmine, of rain on stone, of ozone before a storm. It was the smell of every garden that had ever been and ever would be. It filled my head, silencing the panic, silencing the fear. It was the smell of peace. Of belonging. Of purpose. My terror dissolved, replaced by a profound, startling clarity. My little garden, my fussy arrangement of moss and stone, it wasn't an expression of order. It was an expression of loneliness. A desperate attempt to control a world that was inherently, beautifully, chaotic. I had been tending a prison for a single plum tree. The figures outside my window were not a threat. They were a congregation. The being below, the great, silent heart, was not a monster. It was a creator. It wasn't destroying the world. It was healing it, breaking the concrete and asphalt that had suffocated the land for so long, making it breathe again. The humans, we weren't its slaves. We were its hands. Its gardeners. We were being offered a chance to take part in the creation of a new, boundless garden. My isolation wasn't a symptom of their madness. It was a symptom of my own. I looked at my hands, at the calluses from my years of careful, pointless pruning. I had been tending a memory. They were tending a future. Slowly, I walked to the sliding glass door. The crowd outside watched me, their faces serene. Mr. Tanaka's glowing eyes met mine, and in them, I saw not the loss of a man, but the birth of a purpose. He smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile, and held out a hand filled with the rich, dark, living soil. My carefully constructed life, my career, my solitude, my fears, they all felt like a dream I was finally waking from. The only thing that was real was the soft, living earth. The only thing that mattered was the tending. I slid the door open. The thick, fragrant air of the new world washed over me. I stepped out onto the moss. My bare feet sinking into its cool, damp embrace. The shushurodoshi fell, its clack no longer a sound of lonely timekeeping, but a percussive beat in the great, silent symphony of growth. I walked towards Mr. Tanaka, my hand outstretched. I don't know if I escaped or if I succumbed. Perhaps they are the same thing. My name is Kenji Tanaka, and my entry in the grand ledger of the world is no longer a minor one. I am a part of the garden now. We all are. And it is beautiful. The work is just beginning. There is so much to plant. The quiet contagion. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first lie of the morning is the smell of coffee. It isn't the rich, dark, slightly burnt promise of my own stovetop pot, but the thin, acidic vapor that steams from the stainless steel urns at the daily grind. It's the smell of getting by, not the smell of waking up. My life, at 27, felt like it was measured in such compromises. I lived in Fitzroy, a suburb of Melbourne that prided itself on its curated grit. Street art bled from commissioned walls onto brick fences and wheelie bins. Every third shopfront was a cafe, every other one a vintage clothing store where the ghosts of other people's lives were sold at a premium. I was a fixture in this landscape, a barista with latte art skills that were just good enough, and a dream that was growing stale. My dream had a frequency, 101.5 FM, Melbourne's biggest independent station. From the moment my alarm went off to the minute I slid my key into the cafe door, they were my constant companion. The morning broadcast with Gaz and Leanne was my ritual. Their easy banter, the curated indie pop, the familiar cadence of the newsreader, it was the soundtrack to the life I wanted. I didn't just want to listen, I wanted to be the voice in the dark, the one queuing up the perfect song to get someone through their morning commute. I had a demo tape, a hopelessly outdated term, I know, it was a USB stick, gathering dust in my drawer, a 5-minute slice of a witty, warm, music-loving personality I could only seem to access when a microphone was in front of me. The first time I heard it, I blamed the tram. We were rattling down Brunswick Street, the carriage groaning as it took a tight corner. Gaz was mid-sentence, talking about his disastrous attempt at weekend gardening, when the signal fuzzed. It wasn't the usual fade-out fade-in of a weak signal. It was a sharp, intrusive crackle. Not white noise, but something structured. A rhythmic, almost digital, stutter. Tick-tock-a-hitch. Tick-tock-a-hitch. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then Gaz's voice was back, clear as a bell, none the wiser. I fiddled with my headphones, assuming a loose connection. The city was full of dead zones. But it happened again the next day, in the cafe. The speakers, mounted near the ceiling, were permanently tuned to 101.5. Liam was at the grinder, its roar filling our little laneway space. In the brief silence after he finished tamping the portafilter, it came through the speakers. Tick-tock-a-hitch. Tick-tock-a-hitch. Clearer this time. More deliberate. Did you hear that? I asked, wiping down the steam wand. Liam slammed the portafilter into the group head. Hear what? The sound of my soul dying. Yeah, hear it every day, mate. He was 22, a fine arts student who treated the job with the exact amount of ironic detachment it deserved. His sarcasm was usually a comfort. No, the static. On the radio. It sounded weird. Signal's always been crap in this alley, he said, not looking up from the creamy patterns he was pouring into a latte. Buried in a concrete canyon. Lucky we get anything. I let it go. He was right. It was easy to explain away. I was probably just tired, my brain filling in patterns where none existed. My own anxieties were a form of static, a constant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. The anxiety of rent, of a dwindling savings account, of the widening gulf between the life I was living and the one I'd imagined on the frequency of my dreams. The next Monday, the anomaly changed its shape. It migrated from the airwaves into flesh and blood. An older woman, a regular we called the professor because she always had a stack of thick books with her, came to the counter. She ordered her usual long black, paid with her card, and as she waited for the transaction to approve, she smiled a placid, distant smile. At Carpet Kingdom, she said, her voice a perfect, cheerful monotone, our prices are floored. She delivered the line with the flawless cadence of the radio jingle, a jingle that had been in heavy rotation for weeks. Then the machine beeped. She took her receipt, said a polite, thank you, and returned to her table without a flicker of awareness that she had just recited an advertisement for a warehouse full of cheap acrylic rugs. I stood frozen for a second, my hand hovering over the cash drawer. Liam hadn't noticed, he was out the back wrestling with a new keg of cold brew. I watched the professor open her book, her face serene. It was bizarre. Unsettling. But again, rationalization came to the rescue. Catchy jingles are designed to do that, right? To burrow into your brain. She was probably just thinking aloud. People do weird things. But the weirdness started to pool. It collected in the corners of the day, quiet and insistent. Liam, my sarcastic, art school Liam, developed a new habit. While steaming milk, he'd hum. Not a tune, but a 5-note sonic logo for a major bank. The jingle played constantly on 101.5. He didn't just hum the notes, he reproduced them with the perfect, synthesized pitch of the original. Bada BBBUM. Over and over. A flawless, maddening loop. That ad is really getting to you, huh? I said, trying to keep my tone light. He stopped, the pitcher of milk screaming under his hand. What ad? The bank one. You're humming it. He looked at me, his expression genuinely blank. Was I? Didn't even notice. Catchy, I guess. He went right back to it. Bada BBBUM. Then it was Chloe. She worked the afternoon shift, a whirlwind of nervous energy and gossip. We were overlapping during the lunch rush, slammed with orders. In a lull, she leaned against the counter, sighing. You will not believe what Mark did last night, she started, her eyes wide. We were supposed to go to the cinema, but she stopped mid-sentence. Her posture straightened slightly. Her voice flattened into a smooth, professional announcer's tone. Terms and conditions apply, See website for details. Offer not available in all states. Then she blinked, her normal, animated expression returning. He decided he had to stay late at work to finish a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet. Can you believe it? The conversational whiplash left me reeling. Chloe, what did you just say? That Mark is a spreadsheet-loving tool. No, before that. The terms and conditions thing. She frowned, her brow crinkling in genuine confusion. The what? I didn't say that. I was telling you about Mark. She looked at me like I was the crazy one, a flicker of concern in her eyes. You okay, Tara? You seem a bit stressed. And there it was. The wall. The placid denial. It wasn't just that they were doing it, it was that the doing of it left no trace in their memory. It was a conversational pothole that only I seemed to be falling into. My world was starting to feel like a poorly edited film, full of jump cuts and continuity errors that no one else could see. My isolation was no longer just a feeling, it was a measurable fact. That night, I didn't go out. I canceled plans to see a band with a friend, claiming a headache. The lie felt flimsy, but the truth was impossible. Sorry, I can't come out, I think the radio is reprogramming my friends and I need to stay home and listen for clues. I sat in my small living room, the city lights of Melbourne painting soft shapes on the walls. The radio was on, volume low. I had a notebook and a pen. I wasn't listening to the music anymore. I was listening to the spaces in between. To the silence. And it came. After a song about heartbreak in a coastal town, there it was. Tick-tock-a-hitch. Tick-tock-a-hitch. Tick-a-hitch-tick. Talk. It was longer this time. More complex. A definite pattern. My pen scratched frantically across the paper, trying to translate the sound into dots and dashes, a desperate, clumsy Morse code. Gaz and Leanne came on to wrap up their show for the day. Their laughter sounded forced, brittle. That's all from us. Gaz boomed. Join us tomorrow morning from 6 for more of the good stuff. Have a beautiful day, Melbourne. Leanne added, her voice warm honey. Stay tuned, stay safe, and stay. Her voice hitched. For a fraction of a second, the warmth vanished, replaced by a flat, affectless whisper that seemed to crawl right into my ear. Tuned. Then, just as quickly, it was back to normal. Happy, she chirped, and the station's outro jingle swelled, wiping it all away. But I had heard it. I hadn't imagined it. It wasn't stress. It wasn't coincidence. Something was wrong with the morning broadcast. And it was getting louder. The static wasn't just on the radio anymore, it was in the people. A quiet contagion, spreading on the air, and I was the only one listening. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The next morning, the radio stayed off. The silence in my apartment was deafening, a thick, anxious quiet that the familiar chatter of Gaz and Leanne used to hold at bay. Now, their voices were a source of dread. The tram ride was a study in paranoia. I watched the people around me, their faces illuminated by phone screens, their ears plugged with white earbuds. Were they listening to 101.5? Were they getting their daily dose? A man across the aisle tapped his finger on his knee in a steady, rhythmic pattern. Tick-tock-a-hitch. I flinched, but it was just a nervous habit. Or was it? The daily grind had transformed from a purgatory of routine into a crucible of fear. I walked in to find Liam and Chloe already there, moving with an unnerving efficiency. The radio was on, of course. Leanne was interviewing some local musician. Morning, I mumbled, tying on my apron. Good morning, Tara, Chloe chirped. Then, without breaking her stride as she restocked the sugar packets, she added in a bright, sing-song voice, start your day the day serial way. Liam, wiping down the espresso machine, immediately followed up in a deeper, resonant tone. Part of a complete breakfast. It was a call and response. A perfect, conversational dovetail between two different ad campaigns. They glanced at each other and shared a small, meaningless smile, then carried on as if nothing had happened. My blood ran cold. This was new. This was coordination. I had to know. Guys, I said, my voice tight. What was that? The serial thing. Liam paused, rag in hand. What serial thing? You did a whole ad thing. Together. Chloe laughed, a light, airy sound that didn't reach her eyes. Tara, you're hearing things. We were just saying good morning. Her gaze was patient, the kind you'd give a confused child. It was worse than denial, it was pity. I was the one who was out of sync. I was the one disrupting the smooth, clean flow of the morning. My notebook became my only confidant. During my breaks, I'd sit in the grimy alley behind the cafe, the smell of sour milk and damp cardboard thick in the air, and I'd transcribe. The static was definitely a code. TikTok SHH was its foundation, but there were variations, complex strings of clicks and whispers that I meticulously documented. SHH tick. Talk. Tick-tock. It felt like trying to learn a language by listening to someone clear their throat. Beneath the transcriptions, I started another list, the intrusions. Liam, lowest prices are just the beginning. Hardware chain, while complaining about his landlord. Chloe, melts in your mouth, not in your hand. Chocolate brand, after taking a customer's order for a skim latte. Customer, man in suit like a rock. Ute commercial, when I asked him if he wanted a bag for his pastries. The phrases were always delivered with that same eerie, flawless precision. Detached. Programmed. The original, human thought was the carrier signal, the ad speak was the payload. Desperate for external validation, I fell into the rabbit hole of the internet. My search history became a catalog of paranoia. Strange rhythmic radio static. People repeating advertisements verbatim. Collective auditory hallucination. The results were a predictable mix of audiophile forums discussing signal degradation, papers on tinnitus, and wild conspiracy theories about mind control satellites and reptilian overlords. Nothing matched the specific, mundane horror of what I was experiencing. There were no threads about coworkers suddenly reciting carpet warehouse jingles. The silence of the internet was a roar of condemnation. It's you, it screamed back at me. It's all in your head. That's when I started noticing the posters. The first one was on a telegraph pole near my apartment. A full-color, glossy poster. Most lost pet signs are sad, rain-streaked photocopies. This one was professional. It featured a strikingly beautiful ginger cat with piercing green eyes. Lost. Have you seen ORPHUS? Beloved family member. Desperately missed. The photo was unnervingly crisp, the cat's expression almost human. But the contact number at the bottom was smudged, a deliberate-looking tear in the paper. I felt a pang of sympathy and walked on. Then I saw it again. Pinned to the corkboard at the cafe, right next to the staff roster. Same cat, Orpheus. Same glossy finish. Same torn phone number. Liam and Chloe claimed to have no idea who put it up. A week later, I found it on the back of a toilet door in a pub in the city. Then, taped to the inside of a tram window, the cat's green eyes watching the suburbs slide by. It was impossible. It felt like another glitch in the Matrix, a repeated asset in a poorly rendered simulation. The persistence of it was a quiet scream. It became a secondary obsession, a tangible mystery I could latch onto while the primary one remained maddeningly abstract. Who was Orpheus? And who was spending so much money to find him? My own world was shrinking. I stopped calling my friends. What could I say? Every conversation was a minefield, waiting for the moment they'd drop a perfectly enunciated slogan for pet insurance into a discussion about their love life. The final straw was my sister. Beth lived in Adelaide, and our weekly phone call was usually an anchor. I decided to risk it. I tried to explain, framing it as a weird thing I'd noticed at work, keeping my voice light, casual. And then Chloe just said, "Oh, what a feeling, like in the car ad." It's a bit weird, isn't it? Beth was quiet on the other end. I heard her sigh. "Tara, love, you sound exhausted. You're working too many early shifts. When was the last time you took a holiday?" "It's not that, Beth, I trailed off, losing my nerve." "You've always had an overactive imagination," she said, her voice softening with sisterly condescension. "Remember when you were convinced Mrs. Henderson next door was a secret agent because she had a shortwave radio? That's not. Look, just get some rest. And remember," her tone shifted, becoming bright, musical, and utterly alien. "When it absolutely, positively has to be there overnight, there's only one choice. Silence." A vast, roaring gulf opened up between Adelaide and Melbourne. Between me and the last person I thought I could trust. "Beth?" I whispered. My throat was tight. "What did you just say?" "What?" Her voice was normal again, laced with confusion. "I said you should get some rest. Are you listening to me? You just sang the jingle for a courier company." "No, I didn't," she said, and her confusion was so genuine, so absolute, it was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. "I think you really need to take a break, Tara. I'm getting worried about you." We hung up. I sat on the floor of my apartment, the phone limp in my hand. I was an island. The tide was rising, and the water was made of static. That night, I walked to an all-night electronics store in the city. The air was cool, the streets slick with a recent shower. Under the fluorescent lights, I bought a portable shortwave radio. It felt like a ridiculous, paranoid purchase, the kind of thing Beth's imaginary version of me would do. But I didn't care anymore. Back in my apartment, I sat in the dark, turning the dial. The world crackled into my room. Snippets of Mandarin, the drone of a preacher from the American Midwest, the coded chirps of a maritime weather broadcast. It was a symphony of human distance. And underneath it all, on certain frequencies, I could almost hear it. A faint, rhythmic pulse. The ghost of the signal. I switched the band back to FM and tuned to 101.5. A pop song was playing. I waited. The song ended. And in the 3-second gap before the next one began, I heard it. Tick-tock, tick-tock. My fingers trembled as I turned the main dial, slowly scanning away from the station. The music faded, replaced by hiss. I kept turning, moving through the empty spaces of the frequency band. 101.7. 101.9, pure static. Then, on a seemingly dead channel, somewhere around 102.3, I found it. There was no music. No DJ. Just a voice. A woman's voice, clear and calm. It was looped, repeating the same phrase over and over, with no emotion, no inflection, just the sterile perfection of a recording. "Baked fresh daily, just for you," the voice said. "Baked fresh daily, just for you. Baked fresh daily, just for you." It was the tagline from a popular bakery chain. I'd heard it 100 times, nestled in warm, folksy ads full of smiling families. But here, stripped of its context, floating alone in the dead air of the radio spectrum, it was the most horrific sound I had ever heard. It wasn't an ad. It was a mantra. A lesson. An instruction being beamed out into the quiet, unsuspecting night. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The voice on the dead frequency changed everything. It was the Rosetta Stone for my paranoia. This wasn't a glitch in a single radio station, it was infrastructure. The ads weren't the cause, they were the symptom. The real contagion was the signal underneath, the silent, rhythmic pulse that was methodically retuning the world. I started experimenting. My barista job, once a symbol of my stagnation, became my private laboratory. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe before Liam and Chloe. With trembling hands, I switched the radio from 101.5 FM to a commercial-free public station. Classical music filled the space, all sweeping strings and dramatic minor chords. Liam stumbled in first, rubbing his eyes. "Morning," he grunted. He moved to the grinder, but his movements were clumsy. He spilled beans on the counter, fumbled with the portafilter. "God, got a killer headache," he muttered. Chloe arrived moments later, looking pale and disoriented. "Is the heating on?" "I'm freezing," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. They moved through the morning prep like sleepwalkers, their usual synchronized efficiency gone. They bumped into each other. They forgot orders. The easy, programmed patter was replaced by a sluggish, irritable fog. Then, at the height of the morning rush, with a line of impatient customers snaking out the door, I walked over to the radio and switched it back to 101.5 FM. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. As a perky car insurance jingle filled the air, it was like a light switch being flicked on behind their eyes. Chloe, who had been staring blankly at the cash register, brightened. Coming right up, she chirped to a customer, her voice suddenly full of energy. Liam, who had been struggling to froth a pitcher of milk, expertly finished it with a flourish, his headache apparently forgotten. "Melbourne's #1 for new music," he said to no one in particular, his voice a perfect imitation of the station's imaging. They needed it. They were addicted to the signal. The broadcast wasn't just influencing them, it was fueling them. The thought made me feel sick. I was serving coffee to puppets, and the station playing over the speakers was pulling their strings. My other obsession, the Orpheus posters, was my only respite. They were a mystery that felt solvable, human scale. One afternoon, I saw a new one pinned to a community notice board in the Melbourne Central Shopping Centre. This one was different. The corner with the phone number was pristine, untouched. My heart hammered against my ribs. I found a quiet corner of the food court and dialed the number. It rang twice. A man answered. His voice was gravelly, exhausted. "Hello." "Hi," I said, my own voice a nervous squeak. I'm calling about the poster. For the lost cat, Orpheus." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of traffic. "Tell me," the man said slowly, his voice low and intense. "Where did you see the poster?" "Melbourne Central. But I've seen it all over. Fitzroy, the city." "And the number," he pressed. "Was it torn?" "On the others, yes. Not on this one." Another pause. He let out a long, weary sigh that sounded like it came from the bottom of his soul. "There is no cat," he said. "There never was. It's a test. To see who's still looking. To see who's still paying attention to the things that don't quite fit." His name was Arthur. He was, or had been, a linguistics professor at the University of Melbourne, disgraced for his fringe theories, as he called them, on mimetic contagion and auditory programming. We met 2 days later on a bench in the Flagstaff Gardens, a neutral space where we could see anyone approaching. He was older than his voice, maybe late 50s, with tired eyes and a tweed jacket that had seen better decades. He listened to my story, the static, the ad speak, the shortwave discovery, with a rapt, grim attention. He didn't look at me like I was crazy. He nodded, as if I were merely confirming his own bleakest hypotheses. "It's a mimetic broadcast," he explained, his hands clasped between his knees. What you call the static, the tick-tock is that's the carrier wave. A non-lexical, syntactically complex signal designed to bypass the conscious mind. It primes the brain's language centers. Primes them for what? I asked, my notebook open on my lap. For the payload. The jingles, the slogans. They aren't just ads, Tara. They're packets of compressed ideology. Simplicity. Compliance. Unquestioning acceptance. The broadcast doesn't want to kill us. It wants to streamline us. To overwrite the messy, unpredictable source code of human consciousness with a clean, efficient, commercially driven operating system. He gave a bitter, humorless laugh. The ultimate goal isn't world domination. It's brand loyalty on a civilizational scale. Arthur believed it had started years ago, subtly, slowly, weaving itself into the fabric of commercial media. Now, it was reaching a critical mass. He'd been tracking it, charting its spread. He had maps, recordings, a mountain of data that had gotten him laughed out of academia. The Orpheus posters were his desperate attempt to find someone else like me, someone who was, for whatever reason, resistant or immune. To prove his point, he insisted on a field trip. We took a train to a sprawling suburban shopping center in the Outer East, a place he called a saturation zone. The moment we stepped through the automatic glass doors, I felt it. The air was thick with it. The generic background music that filled the mall wasn't just music, it was woven through with the rhythmic pulse, the tick-tock is now clearly audible if you knew what to listen for. The effect was profound. The shoppers moved with a serene, synchronized drift. There was no pushing, no frustration. At a supermarket, a dozen people reached for the same brand of discounted cheese at the exact same moment, their movements fluid and harmonious. At the checkout, the cashiers didn't offer pleasantries, they recited corporate taglines. "Have a nice day," had been replaced with, "That's the power of a great deal." It was a vision of hell, not of fire and brimstone, but of placid, smiling, absolute conformity. On the train ride back to the city, the cheerful facade Arthur maintained cracked. He looked pale, his hands trembling slightly. "It's getting harder to filter it out," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "The signal is adaptive. It reinforces itself. The affected, their vocalizations, the little jingles they recite, they're acting as microtransmitters. Strengthening the field." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a notebook, identical to mine. He opened it. I expected to see transcriptions of the static, frantic notes like my own. But his pages were filled with something else. Meticulous, hand-drawn reproductions of corporate logos. Page after page of perfectly rendered symbols for banks, fast food chains, and petrol companies. Below them, entire advertising scripts were transcribed in neat, clinical handwriting. "I'm not immune, Tara," he said, his eyes pleading with me. "I'm just aware. I've been fighting it for years, but it's like trying to hold back the tide with a teaspoon." I put up the posters hoping to find someone who was truly immune. Someone who could help me find a way to jam the signal, to build some kind of counterfrequency. He leaned in closer, his voice urgent. "The core of the broadcast, the primary transmitter for this city, has to be the 101.5 tower on Mount Dandenong. If we could just disrupt that, even for a short." He stopped. His entire posture changed. The tension in his shoulders eased. The desperate, hunted look in his eyes vanished, replaced by a calm, pleasant blankness. He straightened his jacket, turned to me, and smiled a warm, empty, customer service smile. "At Telstra," he said, his voice the smooth, reassuring tone of a paid spokesman, "we're committed to connecting Australia. Our comprehensive 5G network offers unparalleled speed and reliability, because we believe in the power of communication to bring people together." He held the smile, waiting. The man I had been speaking to, the desperate, brilliant, terrified Arthur, was gone. There was no flicker of recognition in his eyes, no sign of struggle. The tide he had been fighting had finally washed over him, leaving behind nothing but a clean, polished, corporate shell. I scrambled up from my seat as the train pulled into Flinders Street Station. Arthur remained seated, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his pleasant smile fixed on the middle distance. I was alone again, but this time it was worse. I wasn't just isolated. I was armed with the horrifying truth, and my only ally had just become another voice in the choir. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. Fleeing from the shell of Arthur was like being ejected into a different reality. The familiar, bustling sounds of Flinders Street Station were no longer just city noise. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks, the automated announcements, the faint music leaking from 1,000 headphones, it all felt coherent, part of one vast, insidious composition. Arthur's final, horrifying transmission had given me the key. The power of communication to bring people together. The broadcast wasn't just noise, it had an ideology, a mission statement. It was a unifier, a smoother of edges, a creator of a terrible, placid harmony. I saw the retuning everywhere. A gaggle of teenagers laughing, then pausing to chant a soft drink slogan in perfect unison. A street performer whose guitar rhythm subtly matched the tick-tock-sh of the carrier wave. The city wasn't just infected, it was humming with the signal. It was a choir, and I was the only one who couldn't, or wouldn't, sing along. Desperation is a powerful catalyst. Arthur's last sane words echoed in my head, jam the signal, counter-frequency. He was thinking of technology, of transmitters and towers. But I wasn't an engineer. I was a barista with a dusty USB stick and a dream of being on the radio. And in that moment of pure terror, my dying dream sparked into a desperate, insane idea. I couldn't fight the signal with silence or with technology one didn't understand. I had to fight it with a different kind of noise. My savings account, meant for a bond on a better apartment or a trip somewhere far away, was sacrificed at the altar of my new, terrifying purpose.